This is BBC News broadcasting live from London. Welcome if you're watching in the UK or around the globe. I'm Shaun Ley. Kwasi Kwarteng is no longer Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer or Finance Minister, the BBC has learned. It's not yet clear whether he was sacked by Liz Truss or chose to resign. The Chancellor rushed back to London overnight after cutting short a trip to Washington for a meeting of the International Monetary Fund. After days of turmoil, indeed weeks, on the financial markets following the mini-budget, the Prime Minister is about to hold a Downing Street news conference to explain what's going on with her financial policy, which some Tory MPs have called for tax U-turn.
My advice to the Chancellor would firmly be, do it now. Make sure it's something significant, not just nibbling at the edges, but something that's going to be firm, bold and convincing.
Liz Truss has faced growing calls from within her own Conservative Party to rethink her economic plans. Labour, the principal party of opposition in the UK, says a U-turn would mean Liz Truss has to resign.
Liz Truss, who got us into all of this trouble, rowing backwards desperately, not knowing where she's going and floundering around, What good would that do for Britain?
However, if you've just joined us, welcome to BBC News. The BBC has been told that Kwasi Kwarteng, Britain's Finance Minister as Chancellor of the Exchequer, is no longer in his job. It's not yet clear whether he's been sacked or if he chose to resign. On the morning of today, he rushed back to London to see the British Prime Minister after cutting short a trip to Washington. It follows turmoil on the financial markets after he delivered what he called a fiscal event or a mini-budget just last month. The Prime Minister, who herself was only appointed in September, is about to hold a news conference at Downing Street with speculation that she will announce a U-turn on some of the measures in that mini-budget. Well, let's talk now to our UK political correspondent, Rob Watson. Rob, events have been moving extremely fast today in the UK. Bring us up to date.
I mean, to call it Frantic Friday wouldn't really quite up to the scale, because this is the latest twist in Britain's long-rolling political crisis, a crisis that's been rolling now for some years, but this is a truly profound moment of crisis, a political crisis, an economic crisis, and a crisis really about Britain standing in the world. But to sort of bring us up to date where we are is that if you like, the second most important person in the government, the Finance Minister or Chancellor as it's known here, is going. As you say, we don't know whether it's because he's against the U-turn or because he's been sacked. We simply don't know. But it represents an astonishing moment for Liz Truss, because she's a true believer. I mean, she's what's known as an economic libertarian. She's a politician of the economic right. She believes in lower taxes and smaller states, but essentially that's been rejected by many in her own party, and that's been rejected, of course, by the financial markets.
And what's worrying for her in terms of her long-term future as Prime Minister is presumably that she campaigned on exactly this agenda. The Conservative Party in the country, that's the membership of the Conservative Party, chose her over a rival, the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak, who said that there would be political consequences and economic consequences if her policy was pursued. They decided they wanted it. Now she's having to row back at least on parts of it, we'll know how much, in just over an hour's time.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I say it's a profound political crisis. It's not as if the idea of the mini-budget of the smaller state, the lower taxes, was Kwasi Kwarteng's and it had been foisted on her. This is what she campaigned on. She said Britain is going to be different under Prime Minister Truss. It's like Reaganomics in the United States in the 1980s. So, this idea that you could do what politicians often do, which is make someone a fall guy, right? Well, it's all his fault, it's all her fault. That is going to be so much more difficult. And there's another complication for Liz Truss, and that's one that's not just ideological. It's not just that she was tied to Kwasi Kwarteng in terms of genuinely believing in this approach to economics, but it's about her. I mean, an awful lot of Conservative MPs, and remember, she was the first choice of only 50 of them in that ballot for the leadership, just think she's a dud. I mean, they think she's incompetent, they think that she's robotic, they think that she lacks any kind of empathy. In other words, that she is an absolute surefire vote loser beyond those activists in the governing Conservative Party.
Watson, our political correspondent, thank you very much. Well, let's talk now to Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research, and former joint head of the UK Government Service. Vicky Price, it's good to speak to you today, albeit on a very troubled day for the British political classes and also for everybody else in the country because of the economic consequences that have been experienced over the last few weeks.
Absolutely. I think that adds hugely to uncertainty. But if you look at the markets, though, they seem to have calmed down. Yes, sterling has come down a little bit since the announcement, as we understand it, of the Chancellor going and the U-turn that's about to happen, because, of course, that means less money put into the economy, if you like, and possibly less growth. So maybe they're re-evaluating that element of it, but it remains to be seen where it all settles. But interestingly, the bond markets have come down very significantly, by which I don't mean the bond markets, the prices themselves, but yields have come down. In other words, the interest. The effective interest on those bonds very significantly. In fact, they're below, for the 10-year gilt, at below 4%, which is actually probably incredibly good for homeowners if indeed, some of those interest rate increases we've seen recently may start getting reversed on what they have to pay for fixed rate deals and other deals that they may be entering into. It suggests that the workings of the Bank of England and this U-turn may be calming the markets down, but there are so many question marks still in terms of the longer term sustainability of finances, because if you're U-turning on all this, where is the credibility in terms of knowing really where you may want to be going in the future? So I think one other thing, we were expecting, of course, to get the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility analysis at the end of this month with another fiscal event. Is all this going to happen, or are we going to get the analysis early? Because obviously they're going to have to recalculate everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Given that U-turn.
Vicky, forgive me for interrupting you, but I want to bring people up to date, and you as well, with some further news we're getting. The Chancellor, in his letter to the Prime Minister, which we are about to see, I can't read it, I'm afraid, it's a bit small, but I can read what I can see on the various bits of copy that are appearing, Vicky. In it, he says that it's important that the Prime Minister should at this stage emphasise her government's commitment to fiscal discipline, and also that he himself obviously is confirming that he's been sacked, that it's not a voluntary resignation. There are also suggestions that other members of the Treasury team, Vicky, are going to leave their posts. That's not in his letter. Do you think that she still has to go some way, the British Prime Minister, Liz Truss, in this news conference to reassure people that it's not just a question of throwing him under the bus to protect her own position?
It sounds like it to me, certainly. And as we've been hearing, the political commentators are also suggesting, and maybe, who knows what would happen with her position as well. But it is going to take a little bit of work, not just perhaps getting rid of the Treasury ministerial team, if you like, to get the markets to believe that in the long-term plans are indeed sustainable. And the way that this has gone about, and making announcements without proper analysis, making announcements without even making an attempt to show how things will be funded, has damaged reputation very significantly. And it's going to be pretty hard to get that back. And we've had also, the International Monetary Fund and everyone else, in fact, so looking at the UK with astonishment, really, that at this time when inflation, of course, is the #1 priority, we've ended up, if anything, making things worse even on that front.
Just in terms of this, he's accepted, just to give the phrasing, he has accepted Prime Minister Liz Truss's request he stand aside. You and I know that it's, in political language, that means he was sacked. In other words, if he hadn't stepped aside, he would have been forced out anyway. It wasn't a question of him making this a voluntary choice. And it does look now like the suggestion is that he was summoned back by Downing Street late last night. Of course, the last plane out of Washington, D.C., so he could be in London this morning, went straight into the back door of Downing Street to see the Prime Minister. But all this, in a sense, Prime Ministers often find it useful, don't they, to kind of deflect responsibility to other ministers. And that's why ministers often end up being sacked, to protect the person at the top. How secure does she look economically, though, in terms, Vicky, of the kind of message she will need to project at this news conference to reassure the markets at the first instance before she can start reassuring the British voters?
I presume she's going to have to say that she's learned, she listened, and that she's seen what the implications of what they were suggesting has been in the markets. So the Bank of England had to intervene and buy bonds rather than, in fact, start selling bonds, which is what they intended to do. She probably reassure everyone that the electricity price freeze is going to stay, because that was a very, very important part. But that, of course, is going to cost quite a lot of money. So I think there had been expectations that the markets were going to buy into that quite easily because they understood the importance of it. But of course, they got a bit of indigestion with all the extra tax cutting measures which would have had to be funded. I think she's going to have to work very, very hard to ensure that whatever comes out in terms of policies in the future is going to be responsible, if you want to call it that. Because even if there is a U-turn in places like in areas such as the corporation tax cut that was, or rather reintroducing, if you like, the corporation tax increase, as we're now expecting is going to be the case, down up to 25%, it doesn't actually raise huge amounts of money. So the corporation tax only raised about 50 billion out of something like 800 plus billion that is raised every year. So it's small beer in some ways, but it's more an indication of perhaps where this government may be going. But these U-turns, I don't think, are going to be very positive for her own premiership, I would guess.
Just to give some further information, this is unconfirmed, but there are suggestions that a former British Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, could be the new Chancellor of the Exchequer. That suggestion is coming from Steve Swinford, a political editor of the Times newspaper. It's now being reported by the Reuters news agency. Whether or not it is him, Vicky Pryce, is that the sort of figure that would restore some degree of credibility? In other words, the idea of a newish Prime Minister turns to an old hand politically, someone who dates back to the earliest days of David Cameron's government 12 years ago.
Yes, I can. I was cut off. I don't know what happened.
Hello, Vicky. Can you still hear me? I think we've lost Vicky Pryce, the economic editor. Let me give you a bit of background as you watch us here live on BBC News in the minutes after the resignation of the Chancellor, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng. He says he was invited to step down, which is code for if he hadn't gone, he would have been sacked. Clearly, he recognised that if he didn't move, that there needed to be some kind of signal that government policy was changing. His words have not reassured markets over the last month. His authority has looked weak. The danger is if he'd remained in his post, it would have undermined the Prime Minister's own position. We are seeing shots in Downing Street, the aerial over number 10 Downing Street. Downing Street is on the right in this picture, the door to number 10, that famous black door you'll have seen, and you'll know very familiar if you live in the UK. Wherever else you are in the world, I suspect you'll know it pretty well as well. There's certainly been a lot of activity in and out of that door over the last months. The BBC has been in Ashford, in Kwasi Kwarteng's British constituency, to gauge reaction to the news. The constituency is in the southeast of England.
Get somebody in who knows what they're doing. I don't know who, because amongst all of them in there, I don't think there's anybody who knows what they're doing. So
I must admit, I had every confidence in him as Chancellor, and it just didn't work out.
That's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's always the way, isn't it? The moment you go away to something else, something happens. He has just left Downing Street. We'll try and replay those pictures because they're on a live feed. We'll get them back to you as soon as we can. There we go. His official car is leaving Downing Street. He's been inside talking to the Prime Minister, his former boss. He now returns to the backbenches. After not the shortest career as Chancellor of the Exchequer, arguably his immediate predecessor had that, Nadine Zahawi, who was an interim Chancellor after the resignation of Rishi Sunak. But what we are expecting is that we will get a formal announcement on his replacement when the British Prime Minister, Liz Truss, addresses journalists in about 45 minutes' time. We will have coverage live here on BBC News of all of that, and we'll be trying to establish what may have happened and the circumstances. Let's talk now to a former British minister, a former senior minister, in fact, and for many years on the Conservative front bench in opposition as well as in government. He was Minister for International Trade. He'd also served at the Foreign Office and a number of other postings. Sir Alan Duncan. Sir Alan, thank you very much for being with us on BBC News. First of all, your reaction to the departure at the Prime Minister's request of the British Finance Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Well, it's obviously a very dramatic, sudden step, particularly as they were very close to each other, personal friends. They'd worked together on her leadership campaign. And I think the dismissal of any Chancellor of the Exchequer, Finance Minister, is a drama in any country. But this is very shocking because it's happening at a very critical time. And of course, he's only been there for a few weeks. We've had 4 chancellors in 3 months. We've had 4 prime ministers in 6 years. I'm afraid the British government is not looking at all either stable or competent. So what we've got to hope is that by doing this ruthless deed, we can at least stabilise the economy. I don't think it's going to stabilise the government or our politics, but we need to stabilise the economy and restore an element of confidence into our financial markets, which has obviously been so disastrously lost over the last couple of weeks.
Let me ask you, because you are a Conservative and you've been in the Conservative Party, I think it's fair to say, for most of your adult life.
Yes.
Or maybe even boy and man. I always wonder why we say man and boy. But anyway, I mean, how do you feel at the moment?
I'm a very unhappy Conservative. I have not for some time felt comfortable about the party I naturally and indeed still do support. I feel very alienated from it. And I think a vast swathe of natural Conservatives do feel sort of rather politically homeless. But you know, it's not a happy time, and our prospects, I think, are going to be grim whatever happens. But as a decent Conservative, what comes first are the interests of the country. And our reputation for economic competence has been completely annihilated. And we now have to inject confidence and competence into our management of the economy. So the question now is, will that happen? I think that there is a chance that we can certainly stabilise markets, and that will depend on who the successor is. And it looks as though it's going to be someone like Jeremy Hunt. She'll not want to have a shuffle on the back of this. The chemistry and dynamics of having Rishi Sunak back or Nadhim Zahawi are, I think, impossible. So it's likely to be someone picked from the backbenches who doesn't then create knock-on effects in ministerial appointments. So my money would be on Jeremy Hunt, possibly Mel Stride, actually, who's been a very capable chairman of the Treasury Select Committee. But the question then is, will it restore the political fortunes of this government? And I think the answer to that is no. I think that the Prime Minister is going to remain in dire peril, but we'll have to, I think, pause and sort of take a deep breath and see what happens after the appointment of a replacement Chancellor this afternoon.
Does it matter what she herself says, not just who she puts in that job?
Well, it does matter what she says, because, I mean, I think the real problem here is that this was not just the problem of the Chancellor. I mean, it is her economics which have caused this problem. And she's going to have to backtrack on just about everything she's been talking about. I mean, there are some people who say, oh, why can't the Conservative Party unite? We need unity. Well, it's neither wise nor easy to unite around irrational nonsense. And the economic policy we've seen over the last few weeks has been just that. It has been irrational nonsense. You need to get a greater, you need more discipline in, if not balancing the books, at least not creating massive, unnecessary, expensive extra borrowing at a time of market and fiscal stress. And that's what they've done. They've thrown petrol on the fire unnecessarily and destroyed their reputation for sound economic management. Now they've got to reestablish that, and it's not going to be easy. It does rest heavily, of course, on the person who becomes Chancellor, but the difficulty remains that the Prime Minister's own economic analysis was so unconvincing, it had, I think, taken her to the point of being ridiculed and mocked.
Sir Alan Duncan, thank you very much for talking to us. I want to bring people up to date with exactly what the Chancellor is saying. This is his letter. Dear Prime Minister, you have asked me to stand aside as your Chancellor. I have accepted. It doesn't sound like the terms. We'll learn more later from the Prime Minister of their conversation. The letter adds, when you asked me to serve as your Chancellor, I did so in full knowledge that the situation we faced was incredibly difficult and rising global interest rates and energy prices. However, your vision of optimism, growth and change was right. As I've said many times in the past weeks, following the status quo was simply not an option. For too long, this country has been dogged by low economic growth and high taxation. That must still change if this country is to succeed. The economic environment has changed rapidly since we set out the growth plan on the 23rd of September. In response, together with the Bank of England and excellent officials at the Treasury, we've responded to those events, and I commend my officials for their dedication. It's important now, as we move forward, to emphasise your government's commitment to fiscal discipline. The medium-term fiscal plan is crucial to this end, and I look forward to supporting you and my successor to achieve that from the backbenches. We have been colleagues and friends for many years. In that time, I have seen your dedication and determination. I believe your vision is the right one. It has been an honour to serve as your first Chancellor. Your success is the country's success, and I wish you well. Kwasi Kwarteng. That's the scene at Downing Street. Now, we are waiting for that news conference to begin in about 40 minutes' time. Let's talk now to our political correspondent, Layla Nathu, who is in Downing Street. Layla, what do you make of the way that the Chancellor has characterised his departure from the government?
Well, astonishing pace of events here, Shaun, but I think very interesting statement from the Chancellor there, first making it clear that it was Liz Truss's idea to ask him to leave. He didn't resign, that it was Liz Truss who asked him to go from that position, so clearly something that she thinks is designed to save her position and to shore up her position, both in terms of the financial markets and in terms of her party. But I think interesting to see that in his statement he still points to the fact that he believes in the economic vision that was so central to both Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng in their roles, that mission of cutting taxes to ensure growth, even though that is widely expected to be reversed in the coming hours or so when Liz Truss makes an appearance at a press conference here. But interesting that he outlines that commitment, that he still believes that was the right message and the right path for the country, but then also talking about the need for the government to restore and ensure fiscal discipline. I just think it's astonishing, the pace of events. You heard from Kwasi Kwarteng last night talking about he was 100% sure he was going to still be in his job, flying back from the States first thing this morning. The message coming out from Number 10 this morning was that the Prime Minister and Chancellor were in lockstep, and within hours the Chancellor was kicked out. So, I think this is a precarious moment for Liz Truss. She now has about an hour or so to try and come up with a way of presenting her plans, a decision about what to do with those policies that have gone down so badly within the financial markets and within her own party, whether to U-turn on those and risk the political humiliation that would bring, but also knowing that it would also potentially go some way to restoring the economic credibility. So no easy decisions for Liz Truss. We'll wait to see what she announces when she appears inside a press conference inside Downing Street this afternoon.
It's brutal, this, isn't it, losing your job as a cabinet minister? Yes, he goes out in the official car, but the official car, the kind of phalanx of officials running around and hanging on to your every word, it goes just like that.
Yeah, all the trappings of one of the great offices of state will no longer be at the disposal of Kwasi Kwarteng. But I think, it's worth reflecting on the fact that Britain will now have its fourth Chancellor in under 4 months. That doesn't give the message of stability in the country or a stable government, the one that Liz Truss is trying to project. But I think she has obviously calculated that this is one of the ways, the methods that she has at her disposal to try to restore some calm and some credibility. But yes, Kwasi Kwarteng out of a job, Liz Truss will need to decide rapidly who replaces him, and that in itself will be a decision to keep an eye on, who she appoints in terms of do they have credibility with the markets and what sort of policies they will agree to preside over. Because remember, there are many factions within the Conservative Party, and one of the main groupings are those of her former leadership rival Rishi Sunak, and his supporters are very anxious about the economic plans that have been put in place and have been leading the calls for the reversal. So I think Liz Truss has a big decision to make as to who she puts in charge here at Number 11 Downing Street, and in charge at the Treasury. But I think it is very risky for her to try to untangle herself, her own fingerprints from the mini budget, and she will be doing her best to do that when she makes that press conference later this afternoon.
Layla, I know we'll talk to you again, so if you could stay in Downing Street, that's much appreciated. Layla Nathu, our political correspondent there, live outside number 10 in central London. I'm joined now by the BBC's business editor, Simon Jack. Simon, what's the obvious question is, how has the markets reacted to this news, since they seem to have been the cause of his defenestration?
Well, you know, their massive reaction to the mini budget was definitely the thing that's prompted the events that have taken on such a pace at the moment. Weirdly, in the markets, very little movement after the Chancellor. Usually the sacking of a Chancellor is a big market moment, particularly when it's the fourth one. You're on your fourth one this year.
That implies they priced it in already.
Well, I think what they're focused on is the policy, not the person. And what they are being encouraged by are the persistent rumours that the tax rise of corporation tax rise from 19 to 25%, which was put in place by Rishi Sunak,
which is basically paid by the biggest of businesses.
The big businesses, that was going to be scrapped by Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. It now looks as if that will proceed. Now that's a big deal, because it was going to raise, under the Sunak government, £17 billion a year. So by scrapping that rise was effectively a £17 billion tax cut. So it was a big chunk of the unfunded tax cuts, which the markets didn't like so much. But here's the problem, is there was also an absolutely key plank in the Truss pro-growth, let's get Britain growing, let's get businesses investing again. So you can't scrap it and then turn around and say, oh, it won't make any difference to growth, because that was why it was there in the first place. So there's a real, in terms of the sort of doctrine here, this is a big deal. And also there is an argument that because it's less than half of the unfunded tax cuts, who knows, it might not be enough. All I can say is that the markets at the moment are encouraged, that they want to see that at some point the debt can come down. And this contribution, if they reverse the corporation tax plans, that will help. But financial markets also like stability, and you could hardly say having 4 chancellors in 1 year fits that bill. But at the moment, listen, government borrowing rates are still 4 times as high now as they were a year ago. Now, 2/3 of that was probably because of global issues. Interest rates have gone up around the world. The Federal Reserve in the US have been pushing up.
And that was quite in Liz Truss's argument, wasn't it? When there was this reaction, was to say, hang on, a lot of this is about global factors that are beyond our control.
And that is undeniably true. But it is also undeniable that the mini budget didn't add a little cherry on top of volatility.
And a particularly sour one at that.
Sour one, yes, which was UK specific. And I think that that can't be denied either. At the moment, they're retracing some of that reaction. Interest rates, government borrowing costs are the kind of the canary in the coal mine here. That's the most sensitive thing. It's fallen 0.25% this morning. It's about 0.5% from the highs it reached during the turmoil, which saw the Bank of England have to get involved to stop this kind of panic selling of government bonds.
The difficulty, I suppose, for a lot of people in the UK who have been materially affected by these rises in interest rates. The most recent one came a few weeks ago now. We've got another one. Is it scheduled, at least a meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee in November?
Almost certain they'll raise again,
right.
Yes.
Is the fear that actually that has happened, the expectation is interest rates won't fall back. They might slow the pace, who knows? But that doesn't necessarily translate into what people are paying to support, if they have a mortgage and they own their own property, to support that mortgage, which is a big financial cost for a lot of people.
Well, it's the most money anyone will ever borrow, probably, in their lives to buy their house. And so it's the biggest debt any people will have. A year ago, a £200,000 mortgage on a £300,000 house, so 65% loan to value, was around 2%. That same mortgage is 6% now. So you're seeing a tripling of the interest costs on that. And that is very prohibitive for people who may be refinancing now. I can say 1.7 million people, their fixed deals will expire and they'll have to get a new one over the next 12 months. That is going to be an awful shock. And I think that because of the volatility, the lenders are saying, I'm actually going to have to set my mortgage rates high because I just don't know where the actual market rates are going to go. So although it may come down a little bit from some of the 6.5% that we've seen in the last few days, because we're seeing markets come off slightly, higher borrowing costs for businesses, higher mortgage costs for consumers are now, very much part of real life. And so it just goes to show these market fluctuations aren't just some esoteric stuff that happens on charts and screens. It has real world impact.
We know, because of political history in the last 30 years, that tensions between Chancellor and Prime Minister often have direct economic consequences, because markets are not blind to that. There is a risk, isn't there, here for the Prime Minister? If, in order to pacify the market, she has to appoint somebody who doesn't share her political vision, and then there is tension between the two, number 10 and number 11. It could be John Major and Norman Lamont all over again after Black Wednesday. It could be the endless psychodrama of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And, of course, to go back a bit further, Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Lawson. Nigel Lawson went in the end, but she didn't last much longer after him.
Yeah, or Boris Johnson, Sajid Javid, for example, as well. I mean, in some ways, you want a bit of tension between number 10 and number 11.
Okay.
Number 10 wants to do something, number 11 says, just hang on a second, I'm not sure we can afford that. That's part and parcel of life. But such as the Truss government made a huge deal about the fact they wanted to break away from decades of Treasury orthodoxy, come up with a whole new approach. And they did that. They sacked one of the most senior Treasury officials, Tom Scholar, who was very highly respected. They asked the Office for Budget Responsibility. They said, we don't want you to mark our homework on this occasion. You had the IMF getting involved and saying, criticising individual policies, really, really rare. And because they set out on this sort of bold new vision of low taxes, what have you, it's going to be very difficult to have a school of Truss and a non-school of Truss living next door to each other.
Yes.
And it'll be quite interesting to see who she can get to do the job, because this doesn't look like the most stable government in the world. Do you want to go in to there when you've had 3 people in before you in short order? And what kind of relationship will they have? You remember when Rishi Sunak first came in, it was Dominic Cummings, who was the Chief of Staff at the time, made it very clear that, kind of number 10 machine was going to be in charge.
And that's why Sajid Javid quit.
Exactly. He said, I can't really take that on if I'm going to be told what I can and can't do. So it's going to be interesting what the terms of engagement are. Maybe you get, we've got a couple of, former chancellors. Sunak, I think, is a very unlikely appointment, because they were mortal enemies during the succession race. But Sajid Javid, he's still around. He's an ex-chancellor. Is he going to say, I'll do this if the country needs me, but, here are my conditions. I'm in charge, not you. I mean, it's going to be a very interesting conversation.
Other name being mentioned, the Times is pitting Jeremy Hunt, the former Foreign Secretary and leadership rival to Boris Johnson. For now, Simon Jack, thank you very much. I know we'll talk again. Let me remind you, if you're just joining us, you're watching BBC News. I'm Shaun Ley. The news from London is that Britain's Finance Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, has left the government after less than about a month in the job. He joined as Liz Truss became Prime Minister in succession to Boris Johnson. They shared a joint economic vision, but in the letter which he sent to the Prime Minister today, on Friday, having left abruptly from Washington late on Thursday evening on the last overnight flight out, apparently summoned back to London for talks this morning, you have asked me to stand aside as your Chancellor. I have accepted. When you asked me to serve, I did so in full knowledge that the situation we faced was incredibly difficult, with rising global interest rates and energy prices. He then goes on to say, as I have said many times in the past weeks, following the status quo was simply not an option. For too long, this country has been dogged by low growth and high taxation. That must still change if this country is to succeed. The implication of that is it must still change even if he's not there to bring that change about. It is important, he adds, that as we move forward, the government should emphasise its commitment to fiscal discipline. The medium-term fiscal plan is created to this end, and I look forward to supporting you and my successor to achieve that from the backbenches. We've been colleagues and friends for many years. In that time, I've seen your dedication and determination, and I believe your vision is the right one. It has been an honour to serve as your first Chancellor. Your success is this country's success, and I wish you well. It's not hard. This was written inside number 10, or possibly drafted on the plane as he came back, because he may well have known how this conversation was going to go. Just before he left, and we're seeing him leave in the official car, one of the trappings of office that he will lose later today. Just to clarify, they may allow him to keep it if he's trying to avoid journalists for a couple of days over the weekend, but effectively it will go out. We understand that a number of moves are now happening in the Treasury. His deputy as Chief Secretary of the Treasury, which is also a Cabinet Minister, Chris Philp, has been replaced. He is replaced by the Conservative MP Ed Aga. The impression given this, those with long political memories will recall the night of the long knives when Harold Macmillan, who was Conservative Prime Minister back in this is in 1963, sacked a third of his cabinet because of the mess the government was getting into, and his entire Treasury team went. I think my memory is right. If my memory is right, and I stand to be corrected, they went because he was going to get rid of the Chancellor, and therefore they felt, well, look, you're abandoning a horrible economic policy, therefore we all have to go. The difficult challenge for the Prime Minister now is that this is a vision she had. It's not like a bunch of people came along and said, this would be a good idea, and she thought, well, this will be a great idea. She believes in this stuff. She's written about it longer term. She was a critic inside Boris Johnson's government of some of the economic decisions taken by the then Chancellor Rishi Sunak, who became her leadership rival this summer. She has somewhere to communicate that this is a change, but her fundamental principles remain the same. And that's going to be a very difficult political challenge. Let's talk now to the host. Let's talk now to our political correspondent in Downing Street, Leila Natho, can bring us up to date on these moves. Two Cabinet Ministers who represent the Treasury are both gone after about a month in the job.
Yeah, we haven't had official confirmation of those moves yet from the Treasury, but it would make sense if Kwasi Kwarteng is out of a job, as we do know, has been sacked by Liz Truss, making it very clear he was asked to stand aside. It would make sense that his deputies, as it were, other Treasury ministers also go. So a complete clear out, possibly, we're looking at in the Treasury. So I think this goes to show that Liz Truss is determined to send a very clear message that things in the Treasury in number 11 at Downing Street, her next door neighbour, are about to change, trying to shore up her own position, trying to reassure both the markets and her own party that she is in control and that she is listening to concerns and that she is willing to change direction. But I think interesting to see Kwasi Kwarteng still pointing to the fact that he believed in those policies that have caused all the turmoil in the first place, those tax-cutting measures announced in that mini budget. Kwasi Kwarteng making it clear that he still thought those were the right thing for the country. Clearly, there is a lot of speculation that Liz Truss is preparing to row back completely on those. We'll have to wait and see just how far she goes in reversing on those measures, but all the expectations is that she is going to U-turn on the key planks of her budget and the key planks that she campaigned on to be Tory leader. And I think it's going to be very difficult for her to try and sort of disassociate herself from the budget, from those policies, but she clearly hopes that by clearing out the Treasury, clearing out the Chancellor and getting someone new in place, that she can try and present a fresh start, a clean break from what was before. But I think she's going to have quite a job convincing her party when she has been so closely identified with those policies. But I think she's going to make a huge attempt to try and shore up her position this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leila. I should say that it's, as always, rather complicated in these situations as a moving story and as stories well around. Reuters are reporting these changes at government below Kwasi Kwarteng. We know he's definitely gone, but they're reporting from the Times, which political editor Steve Swinford, who it's fair to say has very strong connections in Downing Street, is making these reports. They have not been confirmed by the BBC, and I should also say that if you look at the Downing Street website, which I've been reading with great interest or hoping something would appear on it, the last press release is dated the 12th of October, appointment of the suffragan Bishop of Beverley. So I think probably we are a bit out of detail and dependent on Downing Street giving it to us officially, but I think it's fair to say that on previous occasions a change of this side has required a significant change inside the Treasury. Let's talk now to the host of Politico's Westminster Insider podcast, Alva Ray. Alva, well, what a morning.
I know, what a morning indeed. It's just really quite incredible. I mean, listening to all your coverage, I think that thing that everyone keeps saying about how difficult it will be for Liz Truss to dissociate herself from this budget really just can't be underlined enough. I mean, it's just extraordinary, sacking her close ally, Kwasi Kwarteng, and replacing him with someone from the other side of the party. I'm just picking up a bit of bewilderment from a lot of people in her cabinet and those around her that this is obviously something that she's felt she really needs to do to save her skin, but in a way it just doesn't really make sense. What is Liz Truss without her ideas? What's the point of a Liz Truss premiership if she's not able to deliver on the things that she has stood for so long? I think it's just an amazing unfolding story.
And presumably that question is a live question. It is being asked at Westminster. It's not within kind of those who have power. It's not just, people like you and me standing outside gossiping. There's substance to this, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's like the real world question for people wondering, still what happens to their mortgage rates? Will the economy be able to stabilise? And this move today really is primarily, it's about that, and then also saving her premiership. And so, the reports that you mentioned, Steve Swinford at the Times reporting that Jeremy Hunt will be the replacement Chancellor. That'll be a move aiming to steady the markets and to buy her a bit of time and hopefully push back any attempts from senior Conservatives to remove Liz Truss as Prime Minister. But even if that happens...
So does that suggest Jeremy Hunt become, if he takes the job, will be something of a human shield?
Well, not necessarily, because it's a sort of, it could be the worst of both worlds in a way, because actually his comments during leadership contest indicate that he's quite instinctively low tax himself. So he's not a surefire... It's not a guarantee that markets will see him as a safe pair of hands. But equally, he's so far removed from Liz Truss's flank of the Conservative Party. So it's just so different ideologically to her in so many ways that it also removes a lot of what she stood for. And so in a way, if that makes sense, it might not necessarily fix the problem. And I think that there's just a real sense of wondering what this means for Liz Truss's longevity. I think in the press conference that we're expecting in the next hour or so, we'll probably see a U-turn on most, if not all, of that so-called mini budget. It's been quite a big budget, but that might not be enough.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the timing. We've now officially had confirmation from Downing Street that the press conference, which informally we had expected at 2 o'clock, is now going to be at 2:30. So there's clearly a few conversations still going on as we speak. And the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason, who is, if anyone knows what's going on outside the Prime Minister, it's probably somebody like Chris, who is always magnificently well informed on these things. He is also, as always, somebody who makes phone calls himself rather than relying on other people to tell him or to make phone calls. He has been on the phone and he says basically Jeremy Hunt is not replying to calls or text asking the question whether or not he is going to be Chancellor or has been appointed Chancellor. I guess you'll read whatever you want to read into that. There's some pictures of Mr Hunt, who, like Boris Johnson, his one-time leadership rival, likes to go by bike wherever he possibly can, which is fair enough. He's a former British Health Secretary, in fact the longest-serving Health Secretary Britain has ever had. These pictures are from Sunday. We didn't know this was happening this week. These are what we call library pictures. Give you an idea, and this is from back in that lovely balmy British summer when he was being interviewed about his view on the prospects of perhaps being a candidate for the leadership of the party. He ruled himself out in the end. He'd had a bruising battle against Boris Johnson some years back, and he certainly back in 2019 he didn't want to go through that again. If it were to, does it have to be somebody who is not associated with Liz Truss and her vision? Is there nobody among her close allies who would have the kind of heft politically, let's leave economically aside, but politically within the Conservative Party, for Tory MPs to say, oh, that's all right, that'll be fine, we can live with that person, we just couldn't live with Kwasi Kwarteng?
Well, I suppose he's trying to fulfill, the replacement Chancellor has to do two things, to sort of reassure the markets, but then also unite the party in a way that isn't too undermining of Liz Truss, which is such a tall order. And so I suppose there were other options, but they would have been seen as even closer to Rishi Sunak than Jeremy Hunt, who did back Rishi Sunak. And so I think it's sort of, it's balancing those two things. I think people close to Liz Truss would say that he makes sense as an appointment because he has made positive noises about low taxes in the past. He's also committed to increasing defence spending. So I think that there's a way you can spin it that he's similar to her, but I'm not sure if anyone else would see it that way. I mean, one cabinet source described the appointment to me as unorthodox, which I think is a sort of understatement. It's just that it really is I suppose quite odd, and it's just a sign of how desperate Liz Truss's situation is. There's the sort of the market pressure, but also her political situation with sort of senior Conservatives circling. There were stories last night that potentially Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt could team up, and sort of with the backing of over 2/3 of the parliamentary party could together really tell Liz Truss that she didn't command the confidence of her party anymore and she needed to go, and that one of them as Prime Minister could replace her. And so I think that's a really important context, that Liz Truss would never normally have sacked such a close ally. It's really just the only option to save her skin.
Thank you very much, Ava, for now. We are getting lines from Downing Street, Prime Minister's letter to Kwasi Kwarteng. PM Truss in letter to Kwarteng, deeply sorry to lose you from the government. She says you have put the national interest first, which is obviously important. I know you will continue to support myself. She says to Kwarteng that she can rely on him for his support. They are, of course, very old friends. And she says, complimentary, you have put the national interest first in retiring from the government. She says she's sorry to lose him as Chancellor, which is what you might expect in a letter of this kind of formal exchange. What we don't know, of course, is the tone of those talks inside Downing Street, inside Number 10. We have had confirmation, however, and this is coming from the BBC at Westminster, that Mr Kwarteng's deputy, who I mentioned just now, Chris Philp, is no longer Chief Secretary to the Treasury. He's moved to the Cabinet Office. Whether he's even still in the Cabinet, I know that sounds a bit confusing, but the Cabinet Office is a department that effectively, and to all intents and purposes, answers to the Prime Minister via another Cabinet Minister. There is already a Cabinet Office, Cabinet Minister. So Chris Philp could have been demoted, or he could be remaining in the Cabinet but not having any role in economic policy. So again, it's all about a signal to the markets that the people who are at the top of this economic policy are no longer involved with this economic policy. The question is, though, there's a number plate, there's a door plate on Number 10 Downing Street, and it says First Lord of the Treasury. In other words, that you see that brass plaque, which gets shined to perfection every morning. I've been there very early hours of the morning seeing the cleaners doing it, and it says First Lord of the Treasury. In other words, that's the boss. The buck, in Harry Truman's words, stops there, not in the Treasury. And that creative tension, as it sometimes is described, between Number 10 Downing Street and the Treasury is exemplified in the relationship between the First Lord of the Treasury and the Second Lord of the Treasury. In other words, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. We'll bring you more from that letter in just a few moments. But let me talk now to Jasmine Cameron-Chileshi, the political correspondent at the Financial Times, and also joining us, Lucy Fisher, chief political commentator at Times Radio. Good to have you both with us, and forgive me for keeping you hanging around. Jasmine, let's start first of all, if you can. What do you make of this morning's events, and perhaps more importantly, what Liz Truss has to do this afternoon, as it is here in the UK, to kind of not give the impression that she is in a panic and that this has been a panic reaction to events and that she's not in control of those events?
I mean, it's really been an extraordinary day, and this is a strategic move on the part of Liz Truss. She's had, all sorts of negative briefings from her backbenchers. We saw at party conference a couple of weeks ago that we had cabinet ministers openly disagreeing with each other. So the sacking of Kwasi effectively allows her to say that her government is in listening mode. They've turned over a new leaf. They've understood the concerns of the markets as well as concerns of backbench MPs, and they are willing to be more flexible on some of their economic ideas. And so I expect that, in the press conference, that will be within the hour. She will come out, she'll, try to put forward a strong position. She'll try to argue that, yes, there are going to be some tweaks to her mini budget, but her government is, she's still in control, and her government is still, on the correct direction. I think it will be quite difficult, though, because actually there is a perception that her government is really lurching from crisis to crisis. If we think back to yesterday, Kwasi was interviewed and he was asked, do you think, you and Truss will be in the role in a month's time? And he said, yes, absolutely. I'm not going anywhere. And then less than 24 hours later, he's been asked to he's been removed from the job. So I think she'll try to position it as a changing of a new chapter for the government. But I think there'll be a lot of scepticism from the markets and especially from MPs.
Lucy, what do you make of the challenge she's got?
The challenge she's got is colossal, and the conundrum at the heart of what's going to happen next, for me, is spelt out in the letter she has written to Kwasi Kwarteng, in which she says, I am very sorry to lose you from the government. We share the same vision. I think many people will be asking, if that's the case, why has she sacked him? And really, what we're going to hear from her in about 45 minutes' time, we expect is a really big unpicking of the mini budget that was only announced 3 weeks ago. But it wasn't just the economic prospectus that the Prime Minister and her Chancellor set out at the beginning of her administration. This was central to the platform on which she stood this summer in the Tory leadership contest, that she was going to cut tax for business. So I think if we are going to hear, as is widely expected, that she is going to implement the increase in corporation tax after all, which she'd promised to shelve, that was due to be introduced next April, corporation tax rising from 19 pence to 25 pence. There's just a lot of concern about what she stands for. What is she doing presiding over an economic vision that is completely different to the one that she promised the party and the fairly limited mandate on which she was elected?
I'm just going to read the letter for those who haven't seen it. I think both of you have seen it, and then kind of get your reaction to the way she has characterised this, given what Lucy said, Jasmine. Thank you for your letter. This is addressed to Dear Kwasi. As a long-standing friend and colleague, I'm deeply sorry to lose you from the government. We share the same vision for our country and the same firm conviction to go for growth. You have been Chancellor in extraordinarily challenging times in the face of severe global headwinds. The energy price guarantee and the energy bill relief scheme, which made up the largest part of the mini budget, will stand as one of the most significant fiscal interventions in modern times. Thank you for your intervention. Thanks to your intervention, forgive me, families will be able to better heat their homes this winter. And the print on this printer isn't very clear. And the needs of jobs and livelihoods will be saved. You have cut taxes for working people by legislating this week to scrap the increase in national insurance contribution. You have set us. No, it says, yes, sorry. This is slightly confusing letter, actually, because it actually appears on Downing Street notepaper, but at the bottom it actually says, best wishes Liz Truss, but it's written over the printed bit says the Right Honourable Kwasi Kwarteng MP. So maybe this has been sent out in haste. But anyway, this is Liz Truss's letter. You have cut taxes for working people, she says. You have set in train the ambitious set of supply-side reforms that the government will proudly take forward. These include new investment zones to unleash the potential of parts of our country that have been held back for too long, and the removal of EU regulations to help British businesses succeed in the global economy. I deeply respect the decisions you have taken today. You have put the national interest first. I know that you will continue to support the mission that we share to deliver a low-tax, high-wage, high-growth economy that can transform the prosperity of our country for generations to come. Thank you for your service to this country and your huge friendship and support. I have no doubt you will continue to make a major contribution to public life in the years ahead. Best wishes, Liz Truss, as I say, signed over the Right Honourable Kwasi Kwarteng MP. I think that's probably a reflection, Lucy, of the haste with which these letters have been drafted and exchanged.
Yeah, so for me, I'm struck by the tone of Liz Truss's letter. It seems very regretful, almost an admission that her hand has been forced by the market turmoil to do away with her Chancellor just 5 or 6 weeks into the start of her premiership. I think interesting now, we know we've got it confirmed that Kwasi Kwarteng's successor is going to be Jeremy Hunt. someone who is a prudent choice from the market's perspective. You know, he's sober, he's serious, he's very experienced, he's held 3 senior cabinet jobs. Of course, he was health secretary for 6 years, and then after that, he was foreign secretary for a year. So in a period in which it looks like the global economy is slowing down and there may be more of these international finance ministers' summits, he will be a steadying force. But of course, he was a big backer of Rishi Sunak. And again, to return slightly to my earlier point, I think lots of MPs and senior Tory MPs are scratching their heads at we've still got Liz Truss in charge, but implementing what looks increasingly likely to be an economic prospectus that's closer to what Rishi Sunak set out, and now going to be backed up by a Chancellor who supported Rishi Sunak in that leadership contest. So I think her problems in the party are far from over.
Let me just very, very quick word, Jasmine. We're pressed for time, but just do you agree broadly with what Lucy's saying about that?
Yeah, and it's quite interesting looking at the tone of the letters. It's quite respectful. As Lucy said, there is a sense of regret. We know that Truss and Kwasi were economic, they were on the same page when it came to their vision of the economy. And I do wonder how, what her relationship will be like with someone like Jeremy Hunt, who was on obviously the more moderate wing of the Conservative Party. And I do definitely agree. I mean, this is certainly not the end to Liz Truss's problems. There'll be all sorts of questions among even Tory MPs who backed Liz Truss, thinking, well, actually, she came into power on a low tax, high growth vision. And if she's not actually implementing that, then what does she stand for? And what is she going to do in power?
Jasmine and Lucy, thank you both very much for talking to us. Let's talk now to Samaya Keynes, who is a journalist writing about Britain's economy for The Economist. Jasmine, sorry, forgive me, Samaya, let me just confirm what Jasmine and Lucy have both been saying, that it has now been officially confirmed that Jeremy Hunt, and these are pictures from Sunday, not from today, is the new British Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister. Is that going to steady the ship, do you think, economically? Is that going to be enough?
I mean, it's a toughie, right? What the government is trying to do is it's trying to give the impression that it's in control, right? What we've seen over the past few weeks is huge instability, the idea of a moron risk premium attached to British assets. And what the government is trying to do is it's trying to say, look, Jeremy Hunt, he's in, it's all okay now, no need to worry. The danger is, though, that investors, markets, care about the detail. They care about the actual policies being announced. The big problem, the economic problem for the government, was that it was both committing to fiscal sustainability. They wanted to get debt as a share of GDP down at some point. And that just looked like it was going to be incompatible with both the extent of tax cuts that they wanted and the level of spending that the Conservative Party would support. Right, so is this new appointment going to fully resolve that? I'm not sure. The corporation tax change will get you some of the way, but not all of the way.
I mean, that's the difficulty, isn't it? This was a colossal amount of tax cuts in historical terms. The debate was over how you were going to pay for it, and it was, we'll get back to you on that. That didn't satisfy the markets. If you now say, actually, we're not going to do all these tax cuts, the issue still remains, given the impact of inflation and your promise that you're going to borrow more, now that borrowing costs have gone up, allegedly precisely because of the budget, the fiscal event that you presented, how you kind of persuade people that actually we now know how to make the numbers add up, when we couldn't persuade you before that we knew how to make the numbers add up.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the numbers here, the Institute for Fiscal Studies put out a figure that the hole that the government would have to fill was around 60 billion, right? Now, most of that was these tax cuts that the Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng had announced, but there was another hole, right? The fiscal outlook has deteriorated, right? There would have been other things that they would have had to have done even without these tax cuts. So that next to that 60 billion hole, the corporation tax cuts are only worth 17, 18 billion, right? So less than a third. And so the question is, okay, well, you might have reversed those. Is the government going to reverse anything else? Are they going to try to cut down on public services spending? That looks very, very difficult given where public services are. Are they going to try and hold back benefit rates? Again, extraordinarily politically difficult. And given where Liz Truss is now in terms of her political credibility with the rest of the party, how much of a mood is there going to be to get more difficult things through? I'm not sure much of one.
So Mayor Keynes, thank you very much for that. Let me just bring you up to date, if you're watching BBC News live from London, that the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, has left the government after being requested by the Prime Minister Liz Truss to step down after weeks of turbulence in the markets and controversy of what the government called a fiscal event, Mr Kwarteng's mini-budget, just a few weeks ago, in which he announced significant tax cuts and promised to come back with more details of how they would be paid for, all designed to achieve growth. This is him leaving Downing Street after agreeing with the Prime Minister that he would leave the government. As he went, we are now learning that Chris Philp, who was his deputy in the Treasury and also a Treasury Cabinet Minister, has been moved to another job, and we're waiting for an official announcement as to who the new Chancellor will be. A news conference will take place in number 10 Downing Street in half an hour's time. Do stay with us wherever you are in the UK or around the world for more live and breaking events from London and around the world. This is BBC News.
Hello, good afternoon. You're watching BBC News. Britain has a new Chancellor. Jeremy Hunt has been named as Chancellor of the Exchequer after Kwasi Kwarteng was sacked as UK Chancellor following the unfunded tax cuts in his mini-budget of 3 weeks ago, which was followed by turmoil on the financial markets and higher mortgage payments for millions of people. Well, Mr Kwarteng had cut short a visit to the United States to return to London this morning, and it's thought the Prime Minister Liz Truss will now announce another U-turn this afternoon, possibly abandoning plans for lower corporation tax, one of the promises in that mini-budget. She's due to hold a news conference in about half an hour's time. Well, let's just talk you through Kwasi Kwarteng being sacked. He's confirmed he's no longer Chancellor. That was in a letter to the Prime Minister. It begins by saying that she had asked him to step aside and that he had accepted. Among the other quotes in that letter, Mr Kwarteng says, "The situation we faced was incredibly difficult with rising global interest rates and energy prices. Following the status quo was simply not an option." His letter continues, "The economic environment has changed rapidly since we set out the growth plan on the 23rd of September. Together with the Bank of England, we have responded to those events." And it concludes, "It is important now as we move forward to emphasise your government's commitment to fiscal discipline. The medium-term fiscal plan is crucial to this end." Well, live now to our political correspondent, Leila Nathu, who is in Downing Street on a day of very, very fast-moving developments. So Kwasi Kwarteng has gone as Chancellor. We are now hearing that Jeremy Hunt is going to succeed him, and we've got a statement from the Prime Minister coming up in a few minutes' time, which she is expected to announce a U-turn, possibly on that mini-budget of last month.
Yeah, what a morning it has been here, Ben. We are expecting, as you say, to hear from Liz Truss in a press conference within the hour or so here at Downing Street. But we do know already that she has sacked her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng. He made that clear in his letter to her that he was asked to stand aside. Her letter back to him reads very warmly, talking about a deep friendship and a shared mission. Interestingly there, I think that she was pointing still to her commitment to having a low tax economy when, of course, she is widely expected to have to row back on those measures in that press conference. All the speculation, the expectation is that she will have to ditch key parts of that mini budget. But I think the message is, with the move of Chris Philp, as well as former Chief Secretary to the Treasury, into the Cabinet Office, is that there is a new regime now in the Treasury, that there is the Prime Minister has listened to concerns. She has been taking soundings from her backbenchers all week. And this is clearly trying to send a message of having taken decisive action. And then there will be the question of what policy changes she announces this afternoon. But I think this is a very tricky line for the Prime Minister to tread, because she is so closely associated with the policies in that mini budget, and she has had to sacrifice her close friend and political ally in Kwasi Kwarteng to try to hang on to her own position. But I think a lot rests now on what she says this afternoon, because her position right now is far from secure.
Exactly, and there's been talk apparently on the backbenches from Conservative MPs about replacing her, if they could, with maybe Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt. That was one report, that there would be a sort of joint ticket to replace Liz Truss. How much danger do you think she's in, and how much was sacking Kwasi Kwarteng and bringing in Jeremy Hunt a way of saving her skin?
Well, I think it's worth saying that there have been all sorts of conversations taking place among Tory MPs, various levels of governments. Various different scenarios are playing out in their minds, and I have to say none of them really looks like a good option. And I don't think that, sacking Kwasi Kwarteng was something that has come as a complete surprise. It was certainly something being talked about this week when you were talking to Tory MPs, entertaining what the Prime Minister could do next to try to restore credibility, restore credibility not only with the markets but in her own party too. So this is not a wholly unexpected move, but I think it does leave her in the same position with trying to answer the question, well, if Kwasi Kwarteng had to go and he was the owner of that budget, who was the other joint owner? It was you. So she finds herself in a position now of having to try to distance herself from the policies over which she has ostensibly sacked Kwasi Kwarteng, and she is going to have to do some work to try to persuade her party, the markets, the public, that she is now prepared to change course dramatically and survive that sort of political upheaval. Because remember, she campaigned precisely on a low-tax platform. Just this week at Prime Minister's Questions on Wednesday, she was fending off questions about whether it was the right thing to do to reverse the rise in corporation taxes, saying it would be wrong to raise corporation tax at the time when the country needed investment. So she has got a huge about turn to do if she is going to reverse, as is widely expected, on those tax-cutting measures. But I think it might reassure her party in terms of economic credibility. It might restore her economic credibility in the eyes of the markets, but it certainly poses a new political danger, and the question as to what exactly she is going to stand for if she continues in office. All right,
Leila, thank you very much indeed. And let's talk to our economics correspondent, Darshini David, who's with me now as well here in the studio. Of course, this crisis after the mini-budget was sparked really by market reaction to that mini-budget, the pound falling, the crisis on the bond markets as well. What has been the response so far of the markets to what we've heard so far, Kwasi Kwarteng being sacked, but what might be to come in terms of a U-turn from the Prime Minister?
Well, it's fascinating because, as you say, the markets have been the judge and jury as far as the last few weeks are concerned in the government's economic strategy. And what we're seeing today, and I cannot believe I'm actually using this sentence, we are seeing relatively muted responses in the market to the events of the last couple of hours. The pound went down when we heard about the resignation of, or rather the sacking of Kwasi Kwarteng. It has gone back up in the last few minutes, but really small movements compared to what we saw over the last few weeks. And the reason is this: they are not judging the man, they are judging the policies. And that is what's needed for credibility. And when we talk about what we're likely to hear from the Prime Minister in the next half hour or so, even if we see some reversals, corporation tax there being talked about as one, there's a few other bits and pieces. The hints in her letter to that outgoing Chancellor, she talks about national insurance, she talks about the energy help. Those are tens of billions of pounds of cost to the public purse. How is it going to be paid for? Can she bring debt down? What does this all mean for the plan for growth we've heard so much about? All those questions we probably don't have answered this afternoon. that means those markets remain pretty anxious.
And there's talk that, in fact, the markets have already factored in a U-turn on corporation tax in particular. So that's a sort of given.
It's a given.
She needs to do quite a lot more to satisfy them.
Well, you know that whole thing about the markets, always say buy on rumour, sell on fact. And the idea that we were going to perhaps see this U-turn on corporation tax had caused them to act as if that were the case in the last 24 hours, ahead of the sacking of Kwasi Kwarteng. So in a way, if we don't get that, that could mean more upheaval. Has she backed herself into yet another corner? And I say another because we heard at Prime Minister's questions, as Layla's referring to, the Prime Minister saying that she could bring down debt in a few years and still not cut public spending. And that is something that a lot of economists out there are saying, surely not. And if they're saying that, well, the markets are keeping a very close eye out. She's put in, a veteran cabinet minister into the post of running the Treasury now. It may not be enough to soothe their nerves. They want to see the hard numbers. They want to see how all of this plays out. And in the meantime, of course, we pay the cost through higher borrowing.
It's going to be fascinating to see what the Prime Minister does say. For the moment, Darshini, very good to see you. Thank you very much indeed for that analysis. Darshini David there, our economics correspondent. And we can talk to Dr. Catherine Haddon, who is Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government. Well, I don't know if you've ever seen anything like this, but we're on to our fourth Chancellor this year, I think. Liz Truss's position as Prime Minister. That isn't a given now, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, obviously, we knew that even before the events of today, that there's been a lot of speculation in her party. But I mean, that is almost usual course for government these days. We've spent the last year with a huge amount of speculation. I think what's really interesting at the moment is actually the questions for the short-term governing that her government needs to do. She has appointed somebody who is a veteran cabinet minister, very experienced in the health brief of dealing with public services, with large budgets and so forth, but hasn't worked in the Treasury. And at the same time, she is about to go out and give this statement. We don't know what that will include, but obviously a lot of speculation about what it means for economic policy. And meanwhile, from the new Chancellor's point of view, he has got this medium-term fiscal statements, as it's being called, which is another of these sort of strange phrases, which basically means another sort of almost mini budget, in 2 weeks' time, 2 weeks on Monday, and also the statement from the Office of Budget Responsibility with forecast. So that's a tall order to suddenly take over in the middle of already a bit of a financial crisis, not knowing how the markets are going to react. We often at the Institute, we talk about the problems of reshuffles and the churn of ministers. You don't have quite this level of churn. We're normally talking about the problems of moving them on after 18 months, 2 years, but it's going to be a very tall order for Jeremy Hunt to get to grips with that. And a big task for the Treasury as well, because they've had a huge amount of upheaval in the last month, losing a permanent secretary, finally getting another, only to then lose their Chancellor and get another. So it really is, a big challenge for them to make sure that there's stable economic policy from here on in. And that's what a lot of people will be looking for.
Do you get the impression that she's going to maybe do U-turns on the mini budget, but also politically she's almost changing her political direction? She's trying to sort of reach out to other parts of the Conservative Party that would say that they've been alienated by her. She's trying to bring them into her tent by bringing in Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor.
Yeah, I mean, for any Prime Minister, managing the backbenches, parliamentary relationships is crucially important. But in recent years, a lot of that has almost been forgotten, got very confused. We had Theresa May with minority governments, almost not realising that actually governing as a minority is quite difficult. We got so used to that, people almost forgot that even when you're governing as a majority, you're still making compromises with your party. You add to the fact that the Conservative Party has got increasingly fractured on all sorts of different issues. It's not a simple binary of support for one person or another, or one position or another. And that makes it difficult for any Prime Minister. And there are tried and tested things that you have to do. But the problem is, once you start to go down the sort of slippery slope of alienating or annoying backbenchers, especially when you have increasingly experienced former ministers who are going to the backbenches with axes to grind because they lost out on a job or they didn't, get a job in her new government. This just makes it harder and harder. And my colleague Alice Lilly has set out a blog for us this week where she talked about the various challenges that I nearly called her Theresa May, but Liz Truss faces on the parliamentary front. And we're already seeing one of those come to a head. So she's still got plenty more to come. And it's going to take a great deal of sophistication in terms of that parliamentary party handling in order to navigate that. And that really does start today with how these changes are seen and also what she says in this press conference shortly.
Briefly, we're going to have this news conference in just a few minutes' time from the Prime Minister. What does she need to do you think, in essence, to maintain the stability of her government, but also her own position as Prime Minister?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult when you see any kind of U-turn. It's almost the worse it gets, the bigger the U-turn that you've got to make. And there are different elements of that. I mean, it's one thing to just sort of reverse the policy that you've done. But if in sticking with the policy for so long, you've created more damage, then you have to do more. You have to go further in order to sort of be able to reverse course on the damage done. And obviously, this is a big move, changing the personnel. That sends out a strong signal. There's obviously been some strategic thinking going on about what kind of U-turn do we need to do. If we've decided we want to fix this, what do we need to do to get to there? I think the big question, though, is not just what she's going to do in policy terms, but what's going to be the tone of that. Is there going to be a sense that, she accepts that some of this was got wrong, or will it be a continuation of, talking about the sort of wider international financial situation that she found herself in, or talking about failures on the comms around the policy, the way it was rolled out? So I think a lot of her party will also be looking at the sort of tone of it and also the undercurrents that come with it. Does she claim any kind of responsibility for herself? Okay. So, yeah, it's a really interesting case study almost in U-turns and whether or not she is able to achieve what she wants to do.
Okay, Catherine, we're out of time, but thank you very much for being with us, Catherine Haddon. You are watching special BBC coverage of the political crisis in Downing Street. Hello, welcome to viewers on BBC One. Britain has a new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, after one of Liz Truss's closest political allies, Kwasi Kwarteng, was asked to step aside as Chancellor after being recalled early from a meeting of global finance ministers in Washington. Well, the Prime Minister is about to hold a news conference in the next few minutes amid speculation that her government is about to make another U-turn over its controversial mini-budget last month, which has prompted turmoil on the financial markets. Now, these are the latest pictures of Kwasi Kwarteng departing from Downing Street. The developments come a day after Downing Street insisted its position on the tax-cutting programme remained unchanged. But opposition to the measures from within the Conservative Party itself has continued and indeed has grown. Now, number 10 Downing Street has tweeted in the last few minutes. It says that Jeremy Hunt has been appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer. It also says that Edward Arger has been appointed Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and the MP Chris Philp has been appointed Paymaster General and Minister to the Cabinet Office, so moved out of the Treasury. Let's go live to Vicky Young, our Deputy Political Editor. What does all this say about Liz Truss and her fight for survival, really, as Prime Minister, that she has brought in Jeremy Hunt as her Chancellor?
Well, yesterday there was speculation about what she was going to do next, given the huge amount of pressure she was under, and lots of Tory MPs saying, would she throw one of her closest political allies under the bus in an attempt to protect herself? Well, it appears that that is exactly what has happened, but I think there will still be Conservative MPs wondering if that's going to be enough, because this is not the idea that a Chancellor who went out on a limb and did something that she didn't agree with. Ideologically, they are completely at one on all of this high growth, low tax, the mini budget itself, it was all signed off. It was a joint effort. And so I think lots of Conservative MPs will want to know now is it's not about the change of personnel, it's about, well, what has Jeremy Hunt said that he wants to happen if he is now taking over that crucial position of being Chancellor? Is the programme going to change? We certainly think there will be more U-turns to come, and we'll find out about those in the next few minutes. And the one that everyone's talking about, of course, is corporation tax. That brings in a huge amount of money for the government. Liz Truss didn't want that to go up in the way that Rishi Sunak, a previous Chancellor, had said that it should. She wanted to keep it where it is. We think now that that will probably change in order, of course, to try and make the numbers add up. That's why the markets have been so jittery. They looked at the huge amount of borrowing that the government was proposing in order to fund tax cuts, and they didn't like what they saw. So I think the real question now is how far is she going to change that programme? And if she does, as we expect, then really where does that leave her whole reason of being in government? You know, she got voted in by Tory members based on these policies, and it looks like she's going to junk a load of them along with her Chancellor.
Yeah, and I suppose the question, Vicky, is how many of those policies she does junk. I mean, you talked about corporation tax. We've heard from the financial markets are already factoring that in as a given, you know, that will be reversed. So it's a question of what else she does, particularly to satisfy those markets, because that is really at the centre of this whole crisis.
Yeah, and remember that the national insurance cut, so it went up in April. It's now going to go back to where it was in November. That's already been voted through the House of Commons. You know, there was not even really much chat about it because Labour was supporting that. So that one has already happened. The other one, of course, is income tax. Now, a penny off income tax due to come in April. Rishi Sunak, during the leadership contest, said that should come in, but not for another year. The question is she going to go along with that and maybe delay it a little bit? Could there be other proposals? Of course, the biggest thing at the centre of that mini budget was, of course, the help for energy bills. It's a huge amount of money, and that, we presume, is going to stay in place. So that doesn't leave her with a lot of room for manoeuvre. Other people making the point that actually what they are doing is things like the rates at which you pay tax, move into tax and go into higher bands. That is staying where it is. It's being frozen. And what it means is more and more people, as their wages go up, get dragged into paying tax in the first place and dragged into paying even more tax. So that does bring in quite a lot of revenue to help maybe fill some of that. But I think, you know, people will be looking now to see the numbers. And this goes back to the original problem. They brought forward this mini budget, which was anything but, had huge sweeping announcements in it, but they didn't have that independent assessment of how the numbers added up. They decided they were going to do that much later, and the markets didn't like it, Tory MPs hated it, and that is why we are where we are now.
And just to put it all into context, I mean, she's only been Prime Minister for, a few weeks. She had said that she would persist with her policies even if they made her very unpopular. She would fight through any unpopularity, but here we are on the brink of what appears like she's going to be announcing a pretty massive U-turn.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways you can fight unpopularity if you've got several years to a general election, for example. I mean, she's only got 2. The immediate problem she had, though, was the reaction of the markets. She, of course, and Kwasi Kwarteng, as free marketeers, wanting markets to do what they have to do. Well, unfortunately, he's been brought down by their reaction to it all. So it's all very well saying you're willing to be unpopular, but then also very unpopular amongst her own MPs. I mean, I've never seen the Conservative Party, even through the incredibly torrid days and last months of Boris Johnson, I've never seen them so despondent, because the difference this time is those opinion polls, which are suggesting to lots of Tory MPs, and they certainly think so, that dozens of them will lose their seats. And that changes the whole political dynamic, because they're looking at this and thinking, well, look, we're going to lose our seats anyway. We've got to do something to sort this out. And one former cabinet minister said to me, look, it's not going to get any better. She's just not up to the job. So even if she changes tack, then they'll say, well, what's the point? Why have we even got her if she's actually just changing what she was voted in to do? So I don't think the trouble is over for her at this point. But I think, you know, even given the incredibly recent volatile times in politics, you know, seeing a government, a Prime Minister and a Chancellor really imploding in this way so quickly is pretty unprecedented.
OK, Vicky, for the moment, thank you, but do stay there. Well, I know you're going to stay there anyway, but we want to talk to you again in just a minute. Still waiting for that crucial news conference from the Prime Minister at number 10 in just a few minutes' time. In the meantime, while we wait for that, let's talk to Darshini David, our economics correspondent. Let's talk about market reaction to what all the developments we've already had, which is the sacking of the Chancellor. But what else are they looking for in terms of stabilisation from this prime ministerial statement we're going to get? What do they want to see in terms of U-turns on that mini budget?
Well, as you've been saying, there's already been a certain amount of reaction in the last 24, 36 hours, Ben, because markets had got wind of this idea we could see something of a U-turn, particularly when it comes to corporation tax. And as we've been saying, what they are doing is judging, not the man at the dispatch box. They don't really mind who is Chancellor. What they really mind about is what these policies are. So is it just that? Could there be more? Because this is less than half of the £43 billion worth of tax cuts that are still on the table. There's as yet unfunded tax cuts. What else could go? There's other measures, of course. There's things like the rules around self-employment and how you pay tax there. There is tax-free shopping, for example. We heard Vicky there talking about the basic rate of income tax. Are those things going to be reassessed, perhaps? But we have got hints from the letter the Prime Minister's written to the outgoing Chancellor that things like the national insurance changes, also that support for energy help, those are going to stay. Now, those cost tens of billions of pounds. So those questions remain. What does this mean for debt going forward? Can she really bring it down, the Prime Minister, I mean? How are you going to fund that? Also, what does this all mean for growth? Because remember, half of the growth plan was about lower taxes might just stimulate growth. And also, one other thing I'll tack onto the back of that. We heard the Prime Minister, we've heard the Chancellor talking about the fact that if they hadn't done this, we would have been heading for the highest tax burden in 70 years. Well, as it stands right now, before any U-turns, we are still looking at the highest tax burden we have seen since round about the 1950s.
And just in terms of how the markets think about all this stuff, it isn't the tax cuts or the policies themselves. It's more the fact it was all unfunded, that it meant tens of billions of pounds of extra government borrowing for years to come.
Indeed. When we talk about the markets, what we're really talking about here are the bond markets, the way that governments fund their borrowing. And what we've seen is those markets taking a bit of a judgment and going, with this much to be borrowed, it's riskier. The UK has become a riskier bet. We're going to have to pay investors a bit of a premium. The other thing tax cuts tend to do is they try to drive up spending and therefore inflation. And that too you have to compensate for. Hence why we saw those increases in the interest rates on bonds in the way we have done. That is why we have seen the highest kind of rates for fixed-term mortgages since the financial crisis. Now, those kind of rates have come down slightly in the last 24 hours or so. There is still a long way to go before we get to where we were prior to that mini-budget. Hard to think, it's just 3 weeks ago now.
Indeed. So we've got the Prime Minister's statement in just a few minutes. Do you think we'll get an instant market reaction to whatever she says? Is it going to be that quick, sort of immediate?
It depends. Well, quite frankly, Ben, a Friday afternoon is normally when the traders have knocked off for the week and headed home or headed
They've all gone home.
Better. What that tends to mean is you do see fairly volatile movements when the people who are left, because trading is quite thin. And if we get what we expect, what we've been primed for, really, this change on corporation tax, you may not see much. It depends how much further she goes, or if she doesn't go that far. And what other indications we get from her and the new Chancellor about what happens next.
Darshini, for the moment, thank you. Let's go back to Vicky Young in Downing Street. We're just, Vicky, 2 or 3 minutes away potentially from the Prime Minister's statement. To what extent do you think she is now fighting for her political life just a few weeks into her premiership?
Yeah, I think she is. I think the issue about sacking your Chancellor is that you will hope that they can take the blame and take the heat off you. Of course, the alternative to that is she is then left completely exposed. And that is because this is a joint endeavour. It was a joint programme. It's something that they have believed for very many years, and an ideology, if you like, that they came in with, and they were determined to push it through. So she can't say that it was an idea that he came up with and now she disagrees with it. And I think that's going to be what we're looking for here, is how much is she willing to say, well, I'm not going to pursue this any longer. And actually, if you look at the letters that they've exchanged, the resignation letter, both of them really saying, look, we're right in what we wanted to do, that the country has got too much tax, the tax take is too high, we need better growth. I suppose she could say, I still believe all that, but the timing's not right. Of course, what most of her MPs would say is, well, we did tell you that and you still went ahead. And I think that's the biggest problem she's got here, is that her rival for that leadership, Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor, very clearly set out what he thought would happen if she pursued her agenda. And exactly what he has said would happen has happened. And that, I think, is why we haven't heard from him very much in public. We have some of his friends, some of those who ran his campaign saying all of it, but he has been proved right. And I think it's going to be very interesting now. I've certainly had some ex-cabinet ministers saying to me, well, look, he could come back, he could be the Prime Minister, he could bring in a lot of talented people from across the Tory party, because that's the other thing she's been very much criticised for, bringing in her own supporters, sacking those who she said to their face, well, you were very good as a minister, you were a very good communicator, you were very good in the department, but you didn't back me, so you're out. And that caused an awful lot of bad blood. Yeah, a lot of stories in the newspapers about how the Tory party feels it's got buyer's remorse. But what about Rishi Sunak? Because we've seen reports that some Tory backbenchers are actually talking about replacing Liz Truss pretty soon with a kind of joint ticket of Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt. Yeah, I mean, yesterday I had MPs suggesting that. Now, others said, well, look, there's all sorts of problems with that. It's actually not that easy to do that if you've got a Prime Minister who doesn't want to go. I mean, we saw that with Boris Johnson, didn't we? You know, it took virtually his entire government had to resign in order for him to finally decide to go. And if Liz Truss decides that she wants to stay put and carry on, which it sounds like she does at the moment, then it is a difficult thing to do. And also, I think that kind of approach, it involves lots of other people deciding that they're going to put their personal ambition to one side. And I'm just not sure that we're in that place. I just think that there are lots of people in the cabinet now who think that they might want a chance of being the next Prime Minister. I'm not sure they would want to go along with some kind of Conservative unity government if they weren't involved with it. And I think there's been so much bad blood, there are so many factions because of this churn of leaders. You have all these people, and that's, I think, the attraction probably to Liz Truss of Jeremy Hunt. He didn't serve under Boris Johnson. He hasn't been in the cabinet for 3 years, so he's not involved with all of that. And I think that is possibly one of the reasons why she's chosen him. We may find out if she tells us why she thinks that he's the man for the job. You talk about the churn of Tory leaders, and actually we've seen the churn of Tory chancellors as well. You just wonder, whoever is leader at the time of the next general election, how much damage all of this will do politically to the Conservative Party. Yeah, and I think that is the overriding sense that I've been getting from Conservative MPs over the last few days. A lot of them think that the damage is done. They think that Boris Johnson, some of the chaos around all of that, did an awful lot of damage, and that this has just compounded that. And it's because it's about the economy. You know, one of the big things that Conservatives have said over the years is we are competent, we're the ones who look after your money, we do things sensibly. And it's a stick that they've used to beat the Labour Party for a very long time. They simply won't be able to do that at the next general election. They have lost that main attack on the Labour Party, and I think that is why lots of Tory MPs are so fearful. I've never seen so many of them almost already giving up on the next election. And again, that's the difference. When we had other Tory leaders deposed, they were got rid of because people thought, well, actually, we can still win the next election. So, you know, Boris Johnson was there waiting in the wings, wasn't he? One former minister said to me yesterday there was a prince over the water waiting to swoop in, somebody that lots of Tory MPs thought, if we get him in, he's going to win us the election. And he did. There isn't that person standing there now to do that. And I think that is why there's so much despondency in the Conservative ranks. Now, of course, there are still some who say, look, it's 2 years to the next election, you can still turn it round. But to turn it round, she is not only junking her Chancellor, she has to have a real think about her entire approach, her entire philosophy, her entire programme for government. So where does that leave her authority? And I think that's the problem she's got with Tory MPs, that they just look at her and they think, well, you haven't been elected by the people to do this. Boris Johnson won the election on a very different manifesto, and coming in and trying to force this through, many of them not willing to go along with it. Vicky, thank you for the moment. And back to Darshini David as we just wait for this
news conference in Downing Street to start, our economics correspondent. Just picking up on what Vicky said, I mean, I suppose there are a lot of people in the city who have traditionally seen the Conservative Party as the party, in their view, of fiscal responsibility. I just wonder how much surprise there has been in the city and financial markets that we have this mini budget with, you know, tens of billions of pounds worth of borrowing required, something they wouldn't have expected from a Conservative government.
Absolutely not. No, the party's reputation as being the party of safe money, and then you get this. Now, I sat on a trading floor during many budgets, and, you know, you could see tiny little minuscule movements sometimes in markets as they poured over the numbers and tried to work out if they added up. This was shock and awe on a major scale as far as they were concerned. They've never seen anything like this. It's just a decade ago, of course, we were talking about austerity, and do you remember George Osborne, the then Chancellor, talking about the need to keep Britain's credit rating, that AAA rating, make sure we could borrow at very low rates indeed in the international market.
Let's go to Downing Street, and here is the Prime Minister.
Good afternoon. My conviction that this country needs to go for growth is rooted in my personal experience. I know what it's like to grow up somewhere that isn't feeling the benefits of growth. I saw what that meant, and I'm not prepared to accept that for our country. I want a country where people can get good jobs, new businesses can set up, and families can afford an even better life. That's why, from day one, I've been ambitious for growth. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the potential of this great country has been held back by persistently weak growth. I want to deliver a low-tax, high-wage, high-growth economy. It's what I was elected by my party to do. That mission remains. People across this country rightly want stability. That's why we acted to support businesses and households with their energy costs this winter. It's also the case that global economic conditions are worsening due to the continuation of Putin's appalling war in Ukraine. And on top of this, debt was amassed helping people through the COVID pandemic. But it is clear that parts of our mini-budget went further and faster than markets were expecting. So the way we are delivering our mission right now has to change. We need to act now to reassure the markets of our fiscal discipline. I have therefore decided to keep the increase in corporation tax that was planned by the previous government. This will raise £18 billion per year. It will act as a down payment on our full medium-term fiscal plan, which will be accompanied by a forecast from the independent OBR. We will do whatever is necessary to ensure debt is falling as a share of the economy in the medium term. We will control the size of the state to ensure that taxpayers' money is always well spent. Our public sector will become more efficient to deliver world-class services for the British people. And spending will grow less rapidly than previously planned. I met the former Chancellor earlier today. I was incredibly sorry to lose him. He is a great friend, and he shares my vision to set this country on the path to growth. Today, I have asked Jeremy Hunt to become the new Chancellor. He's one of the most experienced and widely respected government ministers and parliamentarians, and he shares my convictions and ambitions for our country. He will deliver the medium-term fiscal plan at the end of this month. He will see through the support we are providing to help families and businesses, including our energy price guarantee that's protecting people from higher energy bills this winter. And he will drive our mission to go for growth, including taking forward the supply-side reforms that our country needs. We owe it to the next generation to improve our economic performance, to deliver higher wages, new jobs, and better public services, and to ease the burden of debt. I have acted decisively today because my priority is ensuring our country's economic stability. As Prime Minister, I will always act in the national interest. This is always my first consideration. I want to be honest, this is difficult. But we will get through this storm, and we will deliver the strong and sustained growth that can transform the prosperity of our country for generations to come. I'll now take questions. Can I start with Ben Riley-Smith, Telegraph?
Thank you, Prime Minister. Clearly a difficult day. Can you explain to the public why you think you should remain as Prime Minister, given you've junked a key tax cut that led you to be elected and got rid of your Chancellor?
I'm absolutely determined to see through what I have promised, to deliver a higher growth, more prosperous United Kingdom, to see us through the storm we face. We've already delivered the energy price guarantee, making sure people aren't facing huge bills this winter. But it was right, in the face of the issues that we had, that I acted decisively to ensure that we have economic stability, because that is vitally important to people and businesses right across our country. Harry Cole.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Harry Cole from The Sun. You were the one that wanted to cut the 45p rate. You stood on a platform to win the leadership of the Conservative Party on a platform to cut corporation tax. You and the Chancellor, the ex-Chancellor, designed this budget together, in lockstep, we're told, at times in secret, the two of you. He has to go because of the fallout from it. How come you get to stay?
Well, my priority is making sure we deliver the economic stability that our country needs. That's why I had to take the difficult decisions I've taken today. The mission remains the same. We do need to raise our country's economic growth levels. We do need to deliver for people across the country. We're committed to delivering on the energy price guarantee, which people are already seeing in their bills. But ultimately, we also need to make sure that we have economic stability, and I have to act in the national interest as Prime Minister. Chris Mason, BBC.
Excuse the bluntness, Prime Minister, but given everything that has happened, what credibility do you have to continue governing?
What I've done today is made sure that we have economic stability in this country. Jeremy Hunt, as Chancellor, is somebody who shares my desire for a high-growth, low-tax economy. But we recognise, because of current market issues, we have to deliver the mission in a different way. And that's what we are absolutely committed to do, achieving that stability at what is a very difficult time globally. Robert Peston.
Prime Minister, the former Tory Chancellor, Philip Hammond, has just said that you have totally trashed the Tory party's election-winning reputation for economic competence. Will you apologise to your party?
Well, I am determined to deliver on what I set out when I campaigned to be party leader. We need to have a high-growth economy, but we have to recognise that we are facing very difficult issues as a country. And it was right, in the national interest, that I made the decisions I've made today to restore that economic stability so we can deliver, first of all, helping people through this winter and next winter with their energy bills, but also making sure that our country is on the long-term footing for sustainable economic growth. Thank you very much, everybody.
Prime Minister, aren't you going to say sorry?
A pretty brief news conference there from the Prime Minister, announcing a U-turn there on corporation tax. As you heard, she said it was clear that part of the mini-budget went further and faster than the markets had been expecting. We need to act now to reassure the markets. We have to deliver the mission in a different way, and lots of questions to her from some of the reporters there at that news conference about her own political future. Let's get the assessment of our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young, who was listening to that for us. Vicky, has she done enough, do you think, to save her own job and to stabilise the markets?
Well, I mean, we'll have to wait and see whether she's done enough, but that was incredibly brief. She was saying that actually her fundamental mission still stays the same, and she sounded like someone, slightly irritated that the plan hadn't worked. And she's really saying, look, we just did it a bit faster and it went a bit too far, so the markets didn't wear it. Now, I think there are lots in the Tory party, certainly many in her parliamentary party, who think that it is much more fundamental than that, and just getting rid of her Chancellor won't be enough. One former cabinet minister said, well, you can't just sack somebody for implementing your own policy. It doesn't make sense. But the big U-turn there, obviously, on corporation tax, saying that that change, of course, she wanted not to increase it. It was planned to increase from 19 to 25% next April. She said she didn't want it to happen originally. She's now going back to that. And again, this is something that Rishi Sunak, of course, as Chancellor, brought in, and he thought that that would be the way to try to balance the books. It's a big, brings in a lot of revenue for the government, £18 billion a year, she said. And that was really all she said in terms of any U-turns to do with the mini budget, on top of that other one, of course, where they decided not to cut the highest rate of tax for the wealthiest. And then she said, looking ahead again to October the 31st, that full plan will still be laid out then. And that's when we get that independent, the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, they run the numbers and they will say, your numbers add up, and yes, you will get growth of this amount or you won't. And that is still going to be a crucial day, because really she's just deferred that. She's actually talked about the corporation tax change as a down payment, but she was very careful to talk about fiscal discipline, fiscal responsibility, about the public sector being more efficient, saying spending will grow less rapidly than previously planned. She admitted the whole thing was very difficult. And I think what we need to know, but won't know for a while, is the conversation that she's had with Jeremy Hunt. Interestingly, when he stood in the last leadership race, he was knocked out pretty early on, but he was calling for corporation tax to be cut to 15%. Now, he's obviously changed his mind too. So we'll have to see with a new Chancellor how much the approach is set to change.
Vicky, you mentioned it was a brief news conference. I think it's one of the briefest news conferences from a Prime Minister I've ever seen. What, about 10 minutes? And only took about 3 questions. But the questions focused on, hang on, this was a joint plan with your Chancellor, who you've now sacked. What does this mean for your own political future? Surely if he's going, you've got to go.
Yeah, and that's the big problem that she's got. Everyone knows this was her approach, it's what she wanted to do. They decided to do it in a certain way. And, there were lots of MPs yesterday talking about how Liz Truss, was compared to Margaret Thatcher in many ways. Margaret Thatcher came and tried to do some very, very difficult, unpopular things, but all of them making the point that what you do first is you get the building blocks in place. So in terms of the approach of Liz Truss, that would mean making sure that you get growth going, then you increase the size of the economy, and then you might have the money to then do the tax cuts that you want to do. You don't do it the other way around, and that has been the major blunder here, really, and that's the point. Liz Truss is part of all of that, so her credibility, her authority, I would say that actually already she had some difficulties with the backbenchers because, and I think in the first round of that leadership contest, only 50 of her own MPs voted for her, so she wasn't the overwhelming choice of her party, and that makes it very, very difficult. It makes it a very, very difficult group of people to govern. There's an awful lot of former cabinet ministers, former ministers, all with lots of experience on the backbenches. And I think all eyes now will be on them and whether they feel that her position is unsustainable and what, if anything, they decide to do about it.
All right, for the moment, Vicky, thank you for that instant reaction. Do stay with us. We're going to cross live now and join the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, Labour's John Ashworth, who's on the line. Well, the Prime Minister has U-turned, which is what you were asking for. Are you happy now? Are you satisfied?
Let's be clear what has just happened. Liz Truss has sacked her Chancellor for carrying out the policies of Liz Truss. A set of policies that led to turmoil on the markets, which led to a run on pension funds and soaring mortgage rates for homeowners across the country. On average, £500 more on a mortgage per month for many people. What is clear now is that we have a government in meltdown, and the only party that can offer economic stability and certainty to homeowners across the country, the only party that will be prudent and careful with the public finances and not cavalier with the public finances, and the only party that can grow the economy sustainably and spread prosperity and wealth is the Labour Party. This is clearly a disastrous set of decisions from a disastrous budget. And actually, what we need is not just a change of Chancellor, we need a change of government.
Let me just ask you specifically which measures from the mini-budget should she have changed her mind on that she hasn't changed her mind on? Because, I mean, you supported a cut in income tax generally. You've supported help for people with their energy bills. So what would you like her to have changed in the mini-budget that she didn't announce in that news conference just a few minutes ago?
Well, it was an absolutely disastrous budget, and we were pressing her to reverse it. But we've still got the problem that she has no plan to grow our economy. She has no plan to fix our public finances. She has no plan to rebuild our public services. And homeowners are still facing an increase in their mortgages because of decisions that she took. So, of course, look, you know, getting rid of the Chancellor is understandable in the circumstances. But at the end of the day, people are still facing increases in their mortgages because of Liz Truss. It's why we don't just need a change of Chancellor, we need a change of approach and we need a change of government.
But we've seen that U-turn on corporation tax. What I'm asking you is what other specific measures from the mini-budget would you have liked to see a U-turn or a change of heart on from the Prime Minister?
Well, we were pressing for a change of approach on corporation tax. I'm pleased that she's listened to Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer on that front. We also warned that it was a catastrophic mistake not to allow the OBR to validate the judgments of that budget because it led to doubts on the money markets about whether Britain could finance her debts. So we're pleased that she's U-turned on that front as well. But I think this more broadly tells you something about the judgment of Liz Truss and that this is a government in utter meltdown. And really, at the end of the day, when you've got a government in meltdown, a Prime Minister whose political future continues to hang in the balance, what we actually need is not just a change of Chancellor, we need a change of government because it's only the Labour Party now that offers economic stability, certainty, can manage the public finances sensibly and rebuild our public services.
John Ashworth, thank you very much indeed. And let's get some reaction too from Ian Blackford, who is the SNP's leader at Westminster and can join us as well. So the Prime Minister, well, she said she was listening, that it was clear that mini-budget went further and faster, she said, than the markets were expecting. We need to act now to reassure the markets. We have to deliver our mission in a different way. So were those all sensible statements from the Prime Minister? Were you relieved to hear those statements from the Prime Minister?
Well, I'm relieved that the Chancellor is gone and that we've seen at least some of the unfunded tax cuts. The reversal of the decline in corporation tax has been taken off the table, but we can't lose sight of the damage that's been done. We've had an absolute cataclysmic time in the financial markets, and the harsh reality of this is that in the end, that millions of people are going to be paying more for their mortgages as a consequence of everything that we've gone through over the course of the last few weeks. And the person that's ultimately responsible for that is the Prime Minister. This was her plan. It was economic illiteracy to think at a time that we needed to make sure that we were supporting people through the energy crisis, that the Prime Minister could embark on uncosted tax cuts. And that's why the financial markets have been in the meltdown that they have been in. But the real damage of this, Ben, is it's undermined the credibility of the UK and financial markets, not just here, but right around the world. And there is now a trust premium that's been demanded by financial institutions that we're all having to pay. And ultimately, the Prime Minister is going to have to accept her responsibility. She will, I suspect, ultimately be removed from office. But this has been a black period for us. We have been living in difficult times that have now been made much worse, quite simply because of the incompetence of the Prime Minister. And that is why ultimately she has to accept her own responsibilities. And I'll say to Conservative MPs that in the first instance have the responsibility, the opportunity to do something, they need to look at themselves, because it's our constituents, all our constituents, that are going to be facing higher mortgage costs.
What do you mean that they need to? Are you saying they need to bring in another leader?
Well, they have to accept their responsibilities. I want to see an election that, of course, for those of us in Scotland, we can see the shambles playing out. And We were told way back in 2014 when we had the independence referendum that the strength and stability of the UK, well, that's been blown apart. And
do we need to see another Prime Minister, though? I mean, and we've already had, what, our fourth Chancellor of the year. Do we need to see another change of Tory leader?
We do, because in the end, it's the Prime Minister that has to take responsibility for this. But, you know, to go through a period where we've had 4 Chancellors within a year shows you the shambles that has taken place within the Conservative government. And Ben, we've had a lot of talk, and we heard it from the Prime Minister again today about growth. There's no detail, there's no substance. And if I can contrast what we did, we published an energy plan last week, one that would see our green energy output increase 5-fold, 385,000 jobs created, a platform that would see the opportunities for energy-intensive industries to invest in Scotland. That's the future that we're offering people in Scotland. What we've got is chaos, confusion, and a crisis, a debt crisis, that's been created by the incompetence of this government led by Liz Truss.
But the markets were calling for change to the mini-budget. Opposition politicians like you were calling for change, and she has just announced change. She's just announced a U-turn. So surely she's done what everybody was asking her to do.
There are massive problems in the UK economy, and that's been talked about by a number of commentators over the course of the last few days. And the fact remains, if you go back over the course of the last 20-year period, it's been traditional that there's been a premium on UK debt markets, quite simply because of the challenges that the UK faces. We have an enormous current account deficit, and we are going to remain in difficult times, notwithstanding the changes that have taken place. But it's the lack of a plan, the fact that we're outside the European Union, which has caused so much damage to us because of the limits on our abilities to trade. And it's that contrast between staying on this path with the United Kingdom, or those of us in Scotland that want to get on that life raft called independence and back into the European Union, and that opportunity of a green, sustainable future with investment driven into the Scottish economy. And people here will face that choice of what kind of future do they want to have.
Ian Blackford, thank you so much for your instant reaction to that statement from the Prime Minister. And let's get some analysis from our economics correspondent, Darshini David, who's been with me here in the studio, watching and listening to the Prime Minister. What do you think the markets will make of all of that?
Well, to be honest with you, Ben, not much. And the reason I say that is because we were expecting exactly what we heard from the Prime Minister there, didn't we? We had that U-turn on the planned abolition of the rise in corporation tax rates. And at the same time, they have many questions that remain unanswered. So as we sit here and look at where the markets are right now, sterling has dipped a little bit. It is still below where it was ahead of that mini budget. And when we look at the big thing here, and that is the bond markets and the borrowing costs they imply, both for government and for households, they are still quite a bit above where we were pre-mini budget. So in that sense, anxiety is very much heightened. Why is that? Because we didn't have the fundamental questions answered there. We did have some of the money removed from the public sector's tab, that £18 billion worth of cost that the move in corporation tax rates would have cost. But on the other hand, there is so much remaining. There is £25 billion still of unfunded tax cuts. We've still got that energy package. We still don't know how those are going to be funded. We should talk there about wanting more growth. All Prime Ministers want that, of course. But the plan has been slightly diluted today because one plank of that has been taken away. And this idea as well of reducing debt while not cutting the overall amount of public spending. Economists are saying that's a huge question mark over that. So where does this leave us? Well, when you look at what's on the table here, you've got companies which are in confusion with a constant change of government policy. You've got a public sector being told they may not have budgets which match inflation, and they're already falling behind in that regard. That's not a basis really for growth. So you can see why economists, markets remain very jittery indeed. The hard and fast answers, we're still having to wait until the end of the month. It is numbers they deal with, not words. And at the moment, they don't have them.
So what more could she have done in that very brief statement from Downing Street and very few answers to the 3 questions I think she took from reporters? What else could she have done that would have further satisfied the markets and calmed the markets?
Well, we'd go all the way back to 3 weeks ago, Ben. We were hearing back then, analysts saying, show us the money, show us the assessment from your watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility. We are going to get that. We have to wait until the 31st of October. Explain to us exactly how this all hangs together, because what we've got at the moment, those tax cuts, they tend to put more pressure on inflation unless you have these supply side measures. She mentioned them there. They take time to work. So economists are unconvinced. They want to see if the OBR has rubber stamped these. Otherwise, the riskiness to investors of lending to the UK is perceived to have gone up. That is why people up and down the country are currently facing higher mortgage rates than they would have done otherwise.
And I think she said the medium-term fiscal plan is still scheduled for October the 31st, Halloween. In other words, there was some pressure to bring it forward again. That's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen. We're still going to have to wait to have the answers to the big questions then. And that may not be the end of it, Ben. We may think that's it, trick or treat night. We can have a look through the numbers and go, that's it. The markets are happy or they're not happy. It is not. It depends whether or not the OBR thinks that the government's plans are credible. It all hinges on that. Credibility is incredibly easy to lose with financial markets. It's very difficult, as we're seeing now in real time, to regain. Let's just have a look at the markets. I think you were saying the pound falling slightly. I suppose the Prime Minister would have hoped to see a huge bounce. Indeed. And, we've heard her and other senior ministers talking about the fact there has been turmoil on global markets. And that is very true. This is a really tricky time for the global economy because of that war she keeps referring to. That has pushed up the cost of living. We're living in a high inflation environment. There are big question marks over prosperity around the globe next year. But if you separate out what's happening on global markets from what's been happening in the UK, you can see we've broken away in some regards. There is that risk premium, the trust premium, as some people call it, that investors have to be paid to hold money in the UK, and that is because the UK is seen as a riskier bet. So no, it's not what she would have liked to have seen, but I think we're a way off from seeing the markets calm down at the moment. But I suppose there is time, isn't there? Things might settle down in the next few days. Well, markets are very fickle, as you know. We have seen some very sharp movements indeed. They may settle down, but quite frankly, Ben, they're going to want to see the detail. This whole idea that they can just take this leap of faith when credibility has been so broken is pretty unlikely at the moment. So we're likely to see more volatility in the meantime, not less. And I think the key thing to watch here are those bonds, those things that signify borrowing costs. And it's not just households, it's the government's bill as well. Don't forget, as it stands right now, the government is likely to have to borrow almost £200 billion this year to fund its plans. Now, it's already looking at an interest bill on those plans of way in excess of £100 billion next year. It is climbing every time those borrowing costs climb. And every time that happens, that means there's less money left for other things. So, quite frankly, this is a government that hasn't managed to get its way out of an economic crisis right now. But plenty anyway for all those people on the markets, bond dealers, all the rest of them, to take stock, to digest what has happened today on a pretty tumultuous day politically and with these latest announcements from the Prime Minister. Indeed, and as we were saying earlier, Ben, Friday afternoon, it's normally the time you knock off a bit early on the financial markets, and you like to think that nothing major really happens. But do you think they would have stuck around, perhaps, knowing that there was a lot going on? I think maybe some plans for an early start to the weekend may have been shelved this morning when they saw how things were going on. But what we've seen is absolutely extraordinary. I've not seen it in decades of covering the markets, and it's not the kind of news. How often in fact, we've never seen a Chancellor do a midnight flit back from the IMF to come back only to come back and get the sack. Exactly. So that doesn't exactly inspire confidence in the UK's position within the global markets. I think you find we've got a way to go to regain that, even though we are operating in a very tumultuous atmosphere anyway around the globe. Darshini, very good to have you with us. Thank you very much indeed. That's Darshini David there, our economics correspondent. Well, let's just recap then on that news conference we've been hearing in the last half an hour or so. Very brief news conference from the Prime Minister Liz Truss, in which she made another huge U-turn on that mini budget from last month, reversing her plans to scrap the increase in corporation tax. The move followed the sacking earlier on today of her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng. He is being replaced by the former Health Secretary and Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. Well, Liz Truss insisted that she will, quote, always act in the national interest, and said her government will get through this storm. She was asked whether she would resign as Prime Minister, and she said, I'm absolutely determined to see through what I have promised. Labour said the government is in meltdown. Let's have a listen to some of what the Prime Minister had to say.
My conviction that this country needs to go for growth is rooted in my personal experience. I know what it's like to grow up somewhere that isn't feeling the benefits of growth. I saw what that meant. and I'm not prepared to accept that for our country. I want a country where people can get good jobs, new businesses can set up, and families can afford an even better life. That's why, from day one, I've been ambitious for growth. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the potential of this great country has been held back by persistently weak growth. I want to deliver a low-tax, high-wage, high-growth economy. It's what I was elected by my party to do. That mission remains. People across this country rightly want stability. That's why we acted to support businesses and households with their energy costs this winter. It's also the case that global economic conditions are worsening due to the continuation of Putin's appalling war in Ukraine. And on top of this, debt was amassed helping people through the COVID pandemic. But it is clear that parts of our mini-budget went further and faster than markets were expecting. So the way we are delivering our mission right now has to change. We need to act now to reassure the markets of our fiscal discipline. I have therefore decided to keep the increase in corporation tax that was planned by the previous government. This will raise £18 billion per year. It will act as a down payment on our full medium-term fiscal plan, which will be accompanied by a forecast from the independent OBR. We will do whatever is necessary to ensure debt is falling as a share of the economy in the medium term. We will control the size of the state to ensure that taxpayers' money is always well spent. Our public sector will become more efficient to deliver world-class services for the British people. And spending will grow less rapidly than previously planned. I met the former Chancellor earlier today. I was incredibly sorry to lose him. He is a great friend, and he shares my vision to set this country on the path to growth. Today, I have asked Jeremy Hunt to become the new Chancellor. He's one of the most experienced and widely respected government ministers and parliamentarians, and he shares my convictions and ambitions for our country. He will deliver the medium-term fiscal plan at the end of this month. He will see through the support we are providing to help families and businesses, including our energy price guarantee that's protecting people from higher energy bills this winter. And he will drive our mission to go for growth, including taking forward the supply-side reforms that our country needs. We owe it to the next generation to improve our economic performance, to deliver higher wages, new jobs, and better public services, and to ease the burden of debt. I have acted decisively today because my priority is ensuring our country's economic stability. As Prime Minister, I will always act in the national interest. This is always my first consideration. I want to be honest, this is difficult, but we will get through this storm, and we will deliver the strong and sustained growth that can transform the prosperity of our country for generations to come.
The Prime Minister at a very short news conference in Downing Street in the last hour or so. A short statement followed by just 3 questions from reporters and answers. Let's go live now to our economics editor, Faisal Islam, who's in Washington, which of course is where the former Chancellor was until very recently. He boarded the last plane out of there to come back to London to be sacked. What are your thoughts on the last extraordinary 24 hours, Faisal? And from what you've heard of what Liz Truss said, is it enough, do you think, to calm the financial markets?
Well, Ben, I've never seen anything like it. I've never seen anything like a Chancellor of the Exchequer coming to important international meetings, selling his policies to the world's biggest central bankers, the world's biggest finance ministers, and then being hauled back, as is evident now, hauled back by the Prime Minister on that last plane out of Washington yesterday, cancelling meetings and being fired before, basically via kind of political correspondent Twitter, before he even arrived at number 10. This is absolutely extraordinary stuff. He was obviously defiant when I spoke to him about this. I probably spent more time with him over the past 24 hours, now former Chancellor, than anyone else. And it was clear to me that he felt that there wouldn't necessarily have to be a U-turn on the issue of corporation tax. I gave him 4 opportunities to just, if you like, roll the pitch to prepare for some sort of reversal, and he didn't take it. So I concluded from that the now former Chancellor wasn't fully on board with the idea of rowing back on the corporation tax cut, or the not going forward with an increase. And so it doesn't surprise me now that, having got back, he was fired. The reaction in the markets is stable. The U-turn has been received in the way you'd expect, which is borrowing costs versus last week, at a time when we're expecting the Bank of England emergency funding to be withdrawn. Well, it's going in the right direction. Sterling has gone in the right direction. And you heard there a down payment from the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, a down payment on fiscal credibility that frankly was lost over the past month. So that is a significant turnaround fiscally. £18 billion a year is what that raises that corporation tax rise. It was Rishi Sunak's corporation tax rise that Liz Truss now will enact, which is an extraordinary thing given the tenor of the arguments that we saw within the Conservative leadership campaign. But it's more than that, actually, and I question this. Although I think the Truss administration starts a slow process of trying to win back economic credibility with this and with a new Chancellor, I do question what it does for Trussonomics, because part of Trussonomics was saying that corporation tax cuts generate their own revenue. You don't raise any money from raising corporation tax. That was the point of Liz Truss's economic policy. So in accepting this argument that it raises £18 billion a year, what is left of her philosophy now for everything else? And so we don't know how much of that survives. And that was the argument which won the Conservative Party leadership campaign. She left in a very interesting position in terms of political credibility, but it's the start of a process as yet unfinished of winning back economic credibility. People I've been talking to here, though, say that damage has been done right now that could last for some time. There's extra premiums on government borrowing for the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom looks like a place. Things are happening that only normally you'd expect happening in emerging economies. Currency fluctuations every day, borrowing costs going up and down by huge amounts, chancellors coming back on planes and being fired, and we're not entirely sure where policy goes. So it's the start of a process of winning back economic credibility. What it does for her fundamental political arguments about how the economy works is quite another question. Ben.
Faisal, good to see you there in Washington. Thank you very much indeed. That's our economics editor, Faisal Islam, with his assessment. Just to say, by the way, Jeremy Hunt, who has been named as the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, we gather he is at home at the moment. We're not yet sure if we're going to hear from him imminently, but we are certainly hoping to. Jeremy Hunt at home, but no comment so far as yet from him on being appointed as the new Chancellor of the Exchequer. Let's get reaction now from Sir Ed Davey, leader of the Liberal Democrats. So you heard the Prime Minister, a U-turn on corporation tax. Is that enough, do you think?
Well, Liz Truss has trashed the British economy. She's put hundreds of pounds on people's mortgages, and she's humiliated the Conservative government in the eyes of the world. People are angry, they're fed up, and they're worried about the future. But above all, they are furious with this Conservative Party. So I think it's time they had their say. It's time for a general election.
Well, that's not very likely, is it, to be honest? So are you happy now that Jeremy Hunt is the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, and it looks like a change of direction from the government on the economy?
Well, I look at Jeremy Hunt's track record on the NHS. The NHS and our social care system is in the chaos it is partly because of Jeremy Hunt's record as Secretary of State for Health. And when you look at his ideas on the economy, when he had his 2 bids to be the Tory leader, he wanted cuts in corporation tax larger than Liz Truss. So I'm afraid I don't have confidence, whether it's on the health service or the economy, with Jeremy Hunt.
What would you have liked to hear from the Prime Minister in that Downing Street statement that you didn't hear in terms of calming the markets? I mean, should she have gone further?
Well, I've already told you I think there should be a general election, because I think that actually would calm the markets. Because
just in terms of economic policy, though?
Well, economic policy is clear. We need a new budget. This budget that they put forward has caused this economic turmoil. It's hurting people. They didn't even get the energy support package right for people and for businesses. So I'm afraid their whole economic policy is wrong. They need to go back to the drawing board. We need to make sure that Britain's tax position is credible in the markets, so interest rates won't go up so high. And that's why Liberal Democrats were the first party to call, for example, for a windfall tax on the oil and gas companies, so we have the money to be able to afford to provide the help for people.
Do you think Liz Truss can survive as Prime Minister?
Well, she shouldn't, but there should be a general election. You know, we can't have yet another unelected Prime Minister foisted on the British people by the Conservative Party. I think people are genuinely angry with the Conservative Party. They should have their say. There should be a general election.
But do you think Tory MPs are going to move against her, though, and possibly bring in Rishi Sunak? That was one of the rumours.
Well, I've heard some of the gossip from around Westminster, often through the BBC's own journalists. I don't think the Prime Minister's position is very strong, and I never thought she'd be a good Prime Minister. But to be honest, I'm reflecting to you what I think many British people feel. When I go on the doorsteps, they're angry with this government. You know, last year, or last 12 months, Liberal Democrats beat the Conservatives in 3 historic by-elections in true blue areas, in Buckinghamshire, in North Shropshire, seat the Tories held for 200 years, in East Devon. And when we were talking to people just back then, before the calamitous mini-budget, people were angry with the Conservatives. They think they're out of touch.
Sorry, we're out of time. We're out of time. But thank you very much for being with us. You've been watching special coverage here on BBC News of the political crisis in Downing Street. Now, let's remind you of the main developments as we've had them today. The Prime Minister, Liz Truss, has made another huge U-turn on her mini-budget from last month, reversing her plans to scrap an increase in corporation tax. The Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, has been sacked after flying back from Washington. He's been replaced by the Health Secretary and the former Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. Let's have a listen to some of what the Prime Minister had to say at the Downing Street News Conference a short time ago.
My conviction that this country needs to go for growth is rooted in my personal experience. I know what it's like to grow up somewhere that isn't feeling the benefits of growth. I saw what that meant, and I'm not prepared to accept that for our country. I want a country where people can get good jobs, new businesses can set up, and families can afford an even better life. That's why, from day one, I've been ambitious for growth. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the potential of this great country has been held back by persistently weak growth. I want to deliver a low-tax, high-wage, high-growth economy. It's what I was elected by my party to do. That mission remains. People across this country rightly want stability. That's why we acted to support businesses and households with their energy costs this winter. It's also the case that global economic conditions are worsening due to the continuation of Putin's appalling war in Ukraine. And on top of this, debt was amassed helping people through the COVID pandemic. But it is clear that parts of our mini-budget went further and faster than markets were expecting. So the way we are delivering our mission right now has to change. We need to act now to reassure the markets of our fiscal discipline. I have therefore decided to keep the increase in corporation tax that was planned by the previous government. This will raise £18 billion per year. It will act as a down payment on our full medium-term fiscal plan, which will be accompanied by a forecast from the independent OBR. We will do whatever is necessary to ensure debt is falling as a share of the economy in the medium term. We will control the size of the state to ensure that taxpayers' money is always well spent. Our public sector will become more efficient to deliver world-class services for the British people. And spending will grow less rapidly than previously planned. I met the former Chancellor earlier today. I was incredibly sorry to lose him. He is a great friend, and he shares my vision to set this country on the path to growth. Today, I have asked Jeremy Hunt to become the new Chancellor. He's one of the most experienced and widely respected government ministers and parliamentarians, and he shares my convictions and ambitions for our country. He will deliver the medium-term fiscal plan at the end of this month. He will see through the support we are providing to help families and businesses, including our energy price guarantee that's protecting people from higher energy bills this winter. And he will drive our mission to go for growth, including taking forward the supply-side reforms that our country needs. We owe it to the next generation to improve our economic performance, to deliver higher wages, new jobs, and better public services, and to ease the burden of debt. I have acted decisively today because my priority is ensuring our country's economic stability. As Prime Minister, I will always act in the national interest. This is always my first consideration. I want to be honest, this is difficult, but we will get through this storm, and we will deliver the strong and sustained growth that can transform the prosperity of our country for generations to come. I'll now take questions. Can I start with Ben Riley-Smith, Telegraph?
Thank you, Prime Minister. Clearly a difficult day. Can you explain to the public why you think you should remain as Prime Minister, given you junked a key tax cut that led you to be elected and got rid of your Chancellor?
I'm absolutely determined to see through what I have promised, to deliver a higher growth, more prosperous United Kingdom, to see us through the storm we face. We've already delivered the energy price guarantee, making sure people aren't facing huge bills this winter. But it was right, in the face of the issues that we had, that I acted decisively to ensure that we have economic stability, because that is vitally important to people and businesses right across our country. Harry Cole.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Harry Cole from The Sun. You were the one that wanted to cut the 45p rate. You stood on a platform to win the leadership of the Conservative Party on a platform to cut corporation tax. You and the Chancellor, the ex-Chancellor, designed this budget together, in lockstep, we're told, at times in secret, the two of you. He has to go because of the fallout from it. How come you get to stay?
Well, my priority is making sure we deliver the economic stability that our country needs. That's why I had to take the difficult decisions I've taken today. The mission remains the same. We do need to raise our country's economic growth levels. We do need to deliver for people across the country. We're committed to delivering on the energy price guarantee, which people are already seeing in their bills. But ultimately, we also need to make sure that we have economic stability, and I have to act in the national interest as Prime Minister. Chris Mason, BBC.
Excuse the bluntness, Prime Minister, but given everything that has happened, what credibility do you have to continue governing?
What I've done today is made sure that we have economic stability in this country. Jeremy Hunt, as Chancellor, is somebody who shares my desire for a high growth, low tax economy. But we recognise, because of current market issues, we have to deliver the mission in a different way. And that's what we are absolutely committed to do, achieving that stability at what is a very difficult time globally. Robert Peston.
Prime Minister, the former Tory Chancellor, Philip Hammond, has just said that you have totally trashed the Tory party's election-winning reputation for economic competence. Will you apologise to your party?
Well, I am determined to deliver on what I set out when I campaigned to be party leader. We need to have a high growth economy, but we have to recognise that we are facing very difficult issues as a country. And it was right, in the national interest, that I made the decisions I've made today to restore that economic stability so we can deliver, first of all, helping people through this winter and next winter with their energy bills, but also making sure that our country is on the long-term footing for sustainable economic growth. Thank you very much, everybody.
Aren't you going to say sorry?
So the Prime Minister there with that news conference a little bit earlier on. One of the shortest Prime Ministerial news conferences I've ever seen, about 8 minutes. We timed that as 4 questions in all from reporters, not 3 as I'd previously said, but 4 questions. Pretty short answers to those questions too. So a very brief appearance from the Prime Minister. Let's go to our economics correspondent, Darshini David, who was watching it all with me and listening. Of course, the question is, has it done enough to reassure the markets? Because what started all of this was the reaction of the financial markets to the mini-budget last month.
Yes, a seismic move in markets to what was essentially a 30-minute statement from that former Chancellor just 3 weeks ago. Here we had 8 minutes, which actually failed to calm them at all. Because as we speak right now, Ben, pound has actually slipped somewhat on the back of the Prime Minister's comments. We've also seen borrowing costs as measured by those government bonds we've heard so much about in the last few weeks. They are actually up on the day. Why is that? Well, in part because they were expecting the U-turn we saw on corporation tax, but they still have many questions out there about how all of this is going to be funded. And I say all of this because there's tens of billions of pounds worth of plans unveiled by the government which have yet to be funded, or at least we don't know how they're going to be funded. And on top of that, what does this mean for growth? Well, as we sit here right now, I've been hearing from economists across the city, and a lot of them are saying what we've seen now still means that borrowing costs, as denoted by those bond markets, are above where they were 3 weeks ago, ahead of the mini-budget. What that means is that households and businesses still face much more bills. They're looking to take out new loans. They are using the R word, recession, not growth, growth, growth. They are talking about still a downturn next year. They're saying we're still looking at that as we speak right now. And when we talk about corporation tax rates not rising once again, so many U-turns I can barely remember where we are right now, going around in so many circles. That is another thing. It takes money out of businesses' pockets, money that they may have invested, it may have used to create jobs. So as we sit here right now, there are warnings going out across the city. We could be looking at higher job losses over the next couple of years than we might have expected. So as far as the markets are concerned, all eyes now on the 31st of October. Who knows what we could see ahead of that?
Because there were a lot of phrases the Prime Minister used, like we will do whatever is necessary to ensure debt is falling as a share of the economy, spending will grow less rapidly than previously planned. But in terms of hard specifics and numbers, I think really all we heard was on the corporation tax U-turn that would mean £18 billion more in terms of government revenue. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And you know what? We could have said that ahead of that speech. That's the actual detail we did get with this mini-budget. But we are still left in the dark about how we join the dots and fill the gaps between those various statements, because there is £18 billion now that is not going to be on that tab for the public sector. But there's still £25 billion worth of tax changes that were unveiled 3 weeks ago. There's the energy help package on top of that. We don't know how that's going to be funded. We still don't know. We heard her there talking about the fact that debt could be brought down, that perhaps we're going to have to see spending increases which are smaller than we're used to, which is code, I guess, for they're not going to match inflation. And at the moment, when we see departmental budgets, they're not keeping up with this inflation that's gone much higher, much faster than anyone expected. So public services already under pressure. There's a lot riding on what we see now in the 31st of October. If there's any hint of a thumbs down from the official watchdog, the OBR, brace yourself for more turmoil.
We are braced. Darshini, David, thank you very much. Good to have your company on this momentous day. Thank you, our economics correspondent. And we can talk now to Nimesh Shah, a tax expert and CEO of Blick Rothenberg. Thank you for being with us. What's your immediate reaction to what the Prime Minister said today?
Well, it was another unbelievable U-turn, Ben. We'd already had the 45%. We weren't expecting that the corporation tax would have been reined back like it has been. We expected that this government would have backed businesses with their growth agenda and really pushed through that 19% retention of the corporation tax rate, as I should say. This isn't a tax cut, worth remembering. It's actually a tax increase that's about to take effect from next April.
What, do you think the markets will be reassured by the fact we have a new Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, instead of Kwasi Kwarteng?
Well, we've seen just now that the pound has been sort of trending downwards, even during the Prime Minister's statement. I think what this does do is give a little bit of reassurance to the markets that some of the extra revenue that's going to be generated from the corporation tax increase to 25%, some 18 billion a year that the government are estimating, that number could be a little bit lower. We have heard the R word being mentioned, as you said with Darshini just before. If profits of businesses do suffer, then corporation tax receipts naturally go down as well. So it's not just a case of increasing the rate and therefore more revenue will be generated. We do need businesses to succeed as well. But this 18 billion or estimated 18 billion that's going to be generated through the corporation tax increase from next April, really, in my view, that basically covers the basic rate income tax cut to 19% and the reversal of national insurance. Both those measures were about the equivalent of the 18 billion that's about to be raised. So the books are balanced there, but there's still some unfunded cuts that the former Chancellor mentioned in his mini budget a few weeks ago. We still don't know how those are going to be paid for. I think all eyes will be from the markets on the 31st of October. Unfortunately, Halloween for the government.
Well, speaking of Halloween, is it the case, do you think, that once the markets are spooked, and they have been spooked, it's very hard to unspook them?
Yeah, I think that's right, Ben. We've seen this trending ever since Boris left, and there's been a downward spiral, but it was a dramatic event at the mini budget. The uncertainty that this has created in the markets, but also the uncertainty that it creates for businesses, individuals, workers, self-employed, that's the nervousness really in the economy. We really just need a period of stability now. We've had the two big U-turns, the 45% the other week and corporation tax today. If I was the new Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, I think we just need to back something now, and the Tory party really need to get behind that in order to really stabilise the markets.
I mean, there were statements from the Prime Minister. She was saying that spending will grow less rapidly than previously planned. We'll do whatever necessary to ensure debt is falling as a share of the economy in the medium term. Are those sort of general statements, are they reassuring, do you think, to the markets?
It's just too broad at this stage, Ben. The debt burden of the country is now bigger than the size of the whole economy. And this has been going on since the massive package of support for COVID during the Rishi Sunak era, which was obviously the right thing to do during those unprecedented times. We haven't quite worked out as a government, as an economy, how to really pay back some of that debt burden. Sunak started the journey with the 1.25% health and social care levy, the corporation tax increase, the measure to freeze allowances, which has been a real anchor now on lots of working families because of the effects of inflation. What's happened more recently is a huge reversal of those measures, and now we're backtracking on those reversals as well. So there's still, for me, lots of questions unanswered about how are we going to pay this debt back? But that's a question that we've had for over 2 years now, and I don't think the markets have got those answers.
Good to talk to you, and thank you for that instant assessment of the Prime Minister's statement. Nimesh Shah, tax expert and CEO of Blick Rothenberg. Thank you for your time. And we're going to get more from Downing Street, where it's been a day already of pretty tumultuous political developments. Let's go live now to my colleague, Geeta Guru-Murthy.
Ben, thanks very much indeed. Welcome to Downing Street. Kwasi Kwarteng is out as Chancellor. Jeremy Hunt replaces him, and the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, has reversed her cut in corporation tax, the mini-budget cut that was followed by so much market turmoil. Well, asked why she should stay, she said she was absolutely determined to see through what she'd promised. She said she would always act in the national interest and said her government will get through this storm. Labour says the government is in meltdown. Well, with me is Vicky Young, our Deputy Political Editor. Vicky, this is an extraordinary moment because the question for everyone in Downing Street is whether the Prime Minister can survive and what the financial reaction is going to be. Will it bring stability?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem that she's got is that Kwasi Kwarteng, her closest political ally, it was a joint endeavour. This was a joint programme. This mini-budget was something they've been thinking about and believed in for a long time, and they enacted it together. So the general response from lots of Conservative MPs is, how can you sack your Chancellor for implementing the policy that you wanted? And a lot of them making that point, saying actually she's the problem, it's not necessarily the Chancellor. Now, bringing in Jeremy Hunt, I think, will help in terms of he's not someone who backed her in the leadership race, so it feels like she's being a little bit more inclusive. That was a lot of the problem. When she drew up her cabinet, she didn't include anyone who didn't back her, so maybe that's a sign that she's reaching out a bit more. Lots of people talking, Tory MPs, saying it was humiliating for her to have to do this. And about the performance itself, at a time when not just the markets but the party and the country probably needs reassurance, they felt that her performance was below par. Some being much ruder than that, saying that it was very wooden, another saying to us they were watching it with their hands over their eyes. The fact she didn't take many questions, not a sign of confidence there, that she couldn't defend her position because she couldn't necessarily defend why she's thrown her Chancellor under the bus, as someone put it, while she is still in place. So the markets maybe will be slightly calmer. She has made a huge reversal there, a central plank of her approach. But again, that's part of the problem. She's ripped the heart out of her own budget. So lots of Tory MPs, many of them didn't vote for her in the first place, will be thinking, well, what's the point of having her? She said she was going to do all this stuff. It hasn't worked, that she should go. Now, even some of those who supported her are deeply worried. They think she's under pressure. And of course, if you backed her and liked what she did in the budget, you're now also very irritated because she's rowing back on a lot of it.
So you've got a very divided Conservative Party. The question is, are they likely to unite to get rid of her? Could Jeremy Hunt end up being the successor as a sort of moderate unity candidate potentially? He didn't serve under Boris Johnson, of course, ran against him for the leadership, ran this time too, but didn't get very far.
Yeah, so he's untainted, if you like, by the Boris Johnson years and some of the chaos that was around all of that. And of course, he wasn't in this cabinet either. He's very experienced. But there are some people who've said to colleagues, she's just anointed her successor. You know, there's been a lot of chat in the last couple of days about some kind of unity government, unity within the Conservative Party, that is, with obviously the name of Rishi Sunak there, along with people like Penny Mordaunt, maybe bringing in a cabinet of, from all parts of the party. I just don't know if the Conservative Party is capable of doing that at this time. There are so many factions, there's so much bitterness, you've got an awful lot of ex-cabinet ministers, ex-ministers on the back benches, and there, of course, are still some who have their own ambitions. So having some kind of unity government involves others stepping aside effectively and saying, I'll put my personal ambitions to one side. And I'm not sure that all of them would do that. So at the moment, I think there's lots of Tory MPs who don't want Liz Truss there. They're not quite sure what they're going to do about it. So for that, in that term, she can hang on. What she's done today is signal that she is willing to change to a certain extent. There's still now the 31st of October to come where we get the actual numbers about how it's going to work.
Isn't Jeremy Hunt effectively in charge? Because she can't say no to him about anything, and he does not have her economic outlook at all.
Well, he actually, during the leadership contest, did want a massive cut in corporation tax. He actually wanted to put it down to 15%. Now, I assume he's not going to be making that argument. He obviously hasn't made that argument right here. I mean, we simply don't know what the chats are that they've had. We don't know what he's got her to agree. But yes, she's completely undermined. Her authority is completely undermined. Her credibility is undermined. And again, that's a massive problem when you're trying to lead a very fractious party. Lots of them didn't vote for her in the first place. where the power lies now, well, who knows? I mean, you've got the cabinet, you've got the new Chancellor, and I think until maybe the 31st of October, we're not going to see what else is planned and whether they can, carry on with this approach, which she, of course, has started. But I think, as I say, it's also her personal performance isn't inspiring a lot of her colleagues with confidence.
We're just seeing pictures of Jeremy Hunt. Just fill us in on his background. He's very experienced, isn't he? He was a former health secretary. He ran for the leadership. He's seen as sort of moderate socially, isn't he?
Yeah, so he was also the culture secretary in the cabinet as well, and probably best known for being the health secretary for all those years. Bringing certain controversy himself, with junior doctors and all the rest of it. So, not universally approved of. But within the party, he stood against Boris Johnson. And I remember going to quite a lot of those hustings. It was really interesting because sort of everyone there thought they knew that Boris Johnson was going to win. It was sort of a formality in a way. But lots of Tories listening to him used to come out of those hustings and say, I am going to vote for Boris still, but Jeremy was great. He's really impressive, isn't he? Now, obviously, he didn't win, didn't get close, and then the last leadership race, he was fell out pretty quickly from it all. So lots of people felt his time had passed, actually, that, the moment was back then. He didn't make it against Boris Johnson. He was just unlucky. But actually, here he is, coming in now as Chancellor. I think the fact...
He's recently had he highlighted a cancer battle also that he's had on the personal front.
Yeah, he hasn't gone into details about what that was. He said it was relatively minor. But of course, he's been the chairman of the Health Select Committee. So in a strange way, going from poacher to gamekeeper. So having been the Health Secretary, then quizzing health secretaries after him about what's going on in the Department of Health. But that's given him a certain independence, if you like, from the government. So I think that is probably helping him. Hasn't been as high profile in terms of being in the cabinet. But what we don't know is what he now thinks about what is going on and what he now thinks is going to be the direction of the party and the direction of economic policy.
But
and
if he goes back to sort of Treasury orthodoxy, as some might see it, generally in terms of trying to bring some stability, and if Liz Truss, who has changed her political colours in the past herself many times, I mean, she was a Remainer who embraced Brexit, she was a Lib Dem in her youth, if she now thinks, okay, for my own political survival, I am going to totally switch and I'm going to move back into where the centre of the party might be. Given that the Tories are so far behind the opinion polls, they don't want an election. Might they not be better just hanging on to her for their own sake?
Well, someone said to me yesterday she's the mistress of reinvention. So, as you say, she's changed her mind on lots of things and made the case in an opposite direction. So if she does that again, yeah, that's possible. And obviously by ripping up lots of this budget, she is in some ways doing that. I think the problem she's got then is that the Tory party, the members will say, well, why did we vote for you? You said you're going to do these things and now you're not doing them. That's how she won. She won under a false claim, if you like. And then you've got her parliamentary party saying, well, what's the point of you? All you're effectively doing is bringing in all the policies that Rishi Sunak wanted to do, but without the competence, is how one put it to me.
But can they really change and put another leader in, whoever it is, Penny Mordaunt, who's not very experienced, Sunak, who, fell out famously with Boris Johnson, and his backers. Well, can they really go to a new leader without going to the country now?
Well, they can. Technically they can.
Yeah.
Of course, the rules allow it. Now, I think I've put that to lots of people, lots of Conservative MPs over the last few days, and said, obviously you would look ridiculous, the country wouldn't wear it. And they said, well, look, we look ridiculous anyway. She's trashed our reputation. And lots of them, and this is the crucial thing, those polls, lots of those MPs just think they've lost the next election already, and they think that they are going to lose their seats. So lots of them have talked about damage limitation. Yeah. Could you bring in somebody else? They do not want a general election because as the polls stand, a lot of them would lose their seats and they think they would be handing power to Labour. So they are stuck.
It's much bigger, isn't it, just finally, Vicky, about who's up, who's down, because this is about daily decisions that affect every single person in this country. It's about interest rates, mortgage prices, fuel prices, all the tax levels which keep changing. How can anyone plan anything at the moment? There's a massive feeling of total instability and insecurity on everyday decisions, and that's why this matters.
Yeah, and it matters particularly for the Conservatives because one of the main things that they've beaten the Labour Party with at lots of general elections has been about economic competence. That if a Labour Prime Minister comes in, there's going to be complete chaos. They will just put up taxes and spend loads of money and it'll all be chaotic. Well, people are going to look at that and say, well, hang on a minute. Lots of people might be thinking, well, it can't be any worse than it is at the moment. And that's what the polls are reflecting. And I think that is what upsets Conservative MPs the most, that they think that reputation for fiscal prudence, for being sensible, for being the ones you can trust with the money, that has gone, and it's gone in 5 weeks. and lots of them think that they can't get that back. Now, that's partly why Jeremy Hunt's been brought in, because she obviously hopes, Liz Truss, that he can try and reassure people to say that, look, we can do that. But where that leaves her, personally, is a completely another matter, and there are lots of Tory MPs who don't think she can survive this.
Vicky, I just want to show everyone some pictures we've just had of Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, former Chancellor, just arriving home at the moment. These pictures have just come into us. He, of course, has had to fly back from the IMF in the United States. I don't know if he is answering any questions, doesn't look like it. Famously very close politically and on the personal front to Liz Truss.
Yeah, and I think that's the point of all of this, and this is what's coming through from Tory MPs here, is that this is not her sacking a Chancellor because they've gone rogue and done something they shouldn't have done. She's sacking somebody for implementing the policies that she wanted and that they believed in. So, you know, we're in a very, very bizarre situation, and that's why lots of people think, well, how could she have any credibility because she's sacking someone for just implementing what she actually truly believed in. Now, he looked pretty cheerful there, didn't he? But, I mean, it must be humiliating,
was he
it must
sacked
be
or
embarrassing.
did he resign? Because the two letters are slightly contradictory. The letter that Liz Truss has sent to him, it sort of implies that he stepped down. His letter implies that he was obviously asked to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't really know, and they do sound contradictory. But I think having, you know, we spoke to him yesterday, didn't we, in Washington, and he seemed to be very adamant he was staying where he was, and there wasn't going to be a U-turn, and he was still going to be in the job. Well, that obviously changed overnight, and I think the problem is sacking him might give her a bit of time, but actually it leaves her more exposed in some ways as well.
Vicky Young, for now, thanks very much indeed. Well, let us have a look at how the markets are reacting. It is a very key question, and we are joined now by Russ Mould, I believe, from AJ Bell. Russ, thanks for joining us. Can you just tell us what the market reaction is at the moment?
I mean, the stock market is taking it in its stride. It's up around 1% using the FTSE 100 stock index as a benchmark, though a lot of that is down to a follow-through from a very strong close in the American stock market last night. Probably more importantly, immediately, the pound has lost a little bit of ground against the dollar and the euro, going down to €1.15 and $1.12. And the gilt market, which was initially strong this morning with prices up and yields down, all of that ground that it gained this morning has been lost, so gilt yields and prices are broadly flat, and I guess that probably reflects, oh heavens, another Chancellor of the Exchequer gone, another one coming in. Now we need to check out Mr Hunt's credentials and find out what he's going to do in coordination with the Prime Minister and one who assumes and hopes the Bank of England.
And of course, today was the deadline for the Bank of England's policy. Just explain what's happened on that front.
The bank, I haven't seen any figures from the Bank of England buying today, but they're sticking to their guns at the moment. Mr Bailey, the Governor, that today will be the end of that bond buying programme to help cool and calm down gilt yields, which has generally worked. The 30-year gilt yield that's been causing pension funds so much trouble, forcing them to sell to provide more cash and collateral to insurance policies against gilt yield rises, that is lower than when the Bank of England intervened, but it's still higher than it was before Mr Kwarteng stood up and gave his fiscal event just under a month ago. So again, it's still a very uncertain time. The Bank of England will be pleased with what it sees, but it's too early to do a victory lap because it is promising to stop the buying and the support for the market today. And then from the 31st of October, it is in theory turning to sell gilts and start winding down some of the £800 billion plus of quantitative easing that it's done over the last decade or so. And that's a huge test for gilt yields. Bank of England is raising interest rates. Inflation is way higher than gilt yields. And now the biggest single buyer of gilts for the last decade is turning a seller. Logically, you would assume that gilt yields would rise from here, but I guess the Bank of England's hoping they do so in an orderly fashion rather than a disorderly one, which is what we've seen in the past 2 weeks.
How important is it, do you think, for the markets to hear quickly from the new Chancellor?
Well, I'm sure they'll be looking to him for some sort of statement and some framework, but it's really now all eyes on the 31st of October and Halloween for the joint statement with the Office for Budget Responsibility. I'm sure people will be hankering for quicker action than that. But equally, I think it's probably better to get a fully baked statement rather than the sort of half-baked stuff that we've become accustomed to recently.
And can can anyone really wait that long? I mean, that's some distance off. People are asking whether the Prime Minister can last until next week at the moment.
Yes, I know lettuces don't have that long a shelf span normally. So it is a key question, but I think, again, some proper numbers would be helpful. So if Mr Hunt, with Miss Truss and maybe Mr Bailey of the Bank of England, could provide some degree of framework in terms of where they're going from here. We now know at least some of the parts of the fiscal event are being kept, some of them are not, but I still think ultimately proper numbers would be much preferable to half-baked ones. So yes, if they can do them quicker, fantastic, but if they can't, let's have some proper numbers, not some made-up ones, which is what we've been treated to so far, it seems. Or certainly that's how the market views it.
OK, Russ Mould, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, I'm joined now by Matthew Lesh, Head of Public Policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs, who joins us now. What is your reaction to the fact that Kwasi Kwarteng has gone and Jeremy Hunt has been brought in by the Prime Minister? This looks like potentially a complete change of tack.
Look, I think this is extremely brutal and shocking. We shouldn't forget the Prime Minister and former Chancellor being extremely close friends and very much attached to the hip throughout their political careers in the last decade. I think this is quite disastrous in many ways for the Prime Minister and her authority. It's obviously an attempt to calm the markets and the backbench, but I think risks further undermining her legitimacy. The truth is that I think getting rid of Kwasi is probably not going to solve the underlying issues. And in fact, these very much even predate the current Prime Minister, which is we have very high levels of inflation, rising interest rates, and stagnant growth. And that challenge we now face in terms of ensuring that the fiscal numbers add up in that context, as well as getting the economy back onto better footing and going for growth, is extremely difficult to do and requires a lot of very challenging political and policy work ahead.
But in terms of where your think tank is, which is a place where a lot of the thinking was supposed to have come from, certainly in that sort of part of the Conservative Party position. If Liz Truss rose back from that position, from that libertarian position that she's seen to have held, is she going to lose support? And if there is some sort of mishmash in her outlook, what is going to be the economic effect of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense that the IEA and a number of other free market think tanks have been supportive of, broadly speaking, the idea of going for growth, getting down taxes and showing as well on top of that a need for regulatory reform. Where Truss has very much struggled is when it comes to spending restraint and as well as the huge amounts of debt and borrowing associated with the energy price cap. As well as questions about her ability to do the regulatory reform. I mean, I think U-turns on this policy agenda, you take corporation tax today, are quite disappointing. The UK will now end up with a higher than average corporate tax rate for the OECD, substantially higher than Ireland, which is obviously our next door neighbour, higher than the EU 27. Now that's going to have a negative impact on investment, and ultimately we're going to end up paying for that tax increase as workers, as consumers, and as families. So I think that's generally bad news, and the government's going to need to do something else in terms of investment allowances and encouraging investment in the corporate tax system. I think more broadly speaking, I want to see what the government's able to do in terms of regulatory reform, dealing with some of the issues in the planning system that are holding back infrastructure, holding back solar panels and houses, and fracking and all these other go for growth developments that the country needs. I think we need to see more in terms of business regulations and EU red tape. Now that's the agenda where you can really achieve some medium to long-term growth and really square the circle when it comes to public spending and people's incomes. But that's extremely hard politically and needs to be done very delicately to get support. And I hope it can be achieved, but it seems that it's going to be a rocky road ahead.
OK, Matthew Lesh from the IEAA, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has given this reaction in the last few minutes.
Well, I think the only decent thing that Tory backbenchers could do now is call time on Liz Truss and this entire UK government and allow people across the UK to have a general election. I mean, this is beyond a joke. It was never funny, but Liz Truss has already, through her own decisions, crashed the economy and heaped misery on people who were already struggling with a cost of living crisis. Now today, she has forced her Chancellor to carry the can for her decisions. So she had already shown herself to be completely out of her depth as Prime Minister. As of today, she is also a lame duck Prime Minister. The sooner she goes and the sooner people get the chance to get rid of this Tory government that is doing so much damage once and for all, the better. Of course, the only way for Scotland to permanently get rid of Tory governments we don't vote for is through independence.
Have you spoken to the Prime Minister at all in the last week or so?
No. I mean, Liz Truss hasn't phoned me as First Minister of Scotland. She hasn't phoned Mark Drakeford as First Minister of Wales. So even on these basic courtesies of government, we are political opponents, but we should be working together where we can constructively. That's what I have done with Liz Truss's 3 predecessors in my time as First Minister. So even on these basic things, she has shown herself unfit to hold the office of Prime Minister. Now, that would be one thing if that was just, a sort of political issue and all we were dealing with right now was political psychodrama. That's not a good thing, but it is made so much more serious right now that the price of Liz Truss's incompetence and ideological determination to drive through damaging policies, the price of that has been paid by people the length and breadth of the UK. People who were already struggling with a cost of living crisis are now facing soaring mortgage rates and the cost of borrowing going up. It is unconscionable what in just a month or so in office Liz Truss has done to the UK economy and to the living standards of people in every part of the UK. It's time for her to go. It's time for this entire UK government to go and for people across the UK to get the opportunity to have their say in a general election.
Well, Liz Truss is adamant she's going to be staying on. This is a government you're going to have to work with. If she were to pick up the phone to you tonight, what would your message to her be?
Resign. But beyond that, look, I am not the block to a constructive relationship with the UK government. Liz Truss is the 4th Prime Minister that has been in office since I have been First Minister. I've had deep political differences, obviously, with her 3 predecessors, but I've managed to work constructively to a greater or lesser extent with all of them. And the fact that that relationship hasn't even got past first base with Liz Truss is not down to me, frankly, nor is it down to Mark Drakeford in Wales. It's down to Liz Truss being out of her depth and unfit to hold the office of Prime Minister. Now, we saw Boris Johnson being unfit for very different reasons. Liz Truss hasn't even managed to show a basic level of competence in the job. And as I said a moment ago, if that was just an abstract problem, that would be one thing. But the price of that incompetence is being paid by people right now in the value of their mortgage repayments going up every month, in the cost of living crisis that people are already struggling with. This can't go on. It's not sustainable. And the sooner we see the back of Liz Truss and that entire Tory government, the better for everybody.
Nicola Sturgeon there joining the cause now for a general election. Well, the Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, John Ashworth, gave Labour's reaction.
Let's be clear what has just happened. Liz Truss has sacked her Chancellor for carrying out the policies of Liz Truss. A set of policies that led to turmoil on the markets, which led to a run on pension funds and soaring mortgage rates for homeowners across the country. On average, £500 more on a mortgage per month for many people. What is clear now is that we have a government in meltdown, and the only party that can offer economic stability and certainty to homeowners across the country, the only party that will be prudent and careful with the public finances and not cavalier with the public finances, and the only party that can grow the economy sustainably and spread prosperity and wealth is the Labour Party. This is clearly a disastrous set of decisions from a disastrous budget. And actually, what we need is not just a change of Chancellor, we need a change of government. It was an absolutely disastrous budget, and we were pressing her to reverse it. But we've still got the problem that she has no plan to grow our economy. She has no plan to fix our public finances. She has no plan to rebuild our public services. And homeowners are still facing an increase in their mortgages because of decisions that she took. So, of course, look, getting rid of the Chancellor is understandable in the circumstances. But at the end of the day, people are still facing increases in their mortgages because of Liz Truss. It's why we don't just need a change of Chancellor, we need a change of approach and we need a change of government.
John Ashworth there for the Labour Party. Well, in her letter to Kwasi Kwarteng, Liz Truss wrote, "I am deeply sorry to lose you from the government. We share the same vision for our country and the same firm conviction to go for growth. You have been Chancellor in extraordinarily challenging times in the face of severe global headwinds. Thanks to your intervention, families will be able to heat their homes this winter and thousands of jobs and livelihoods will be saved. You've set in train an ambitious set of supply-side reforms this government will proudly take forward." Well, we'll be bringing you much more in the coming minutes. Stay with us. This is BBC News. We just wanted to say goodbye to our friends and viewers on BBC World, but here in the UK, let's catch up with the weather. It is wet here in Downing Street. Here's Sarah Keith-Lucas.